Ladies and gentlemen, look. Dark Souls rocked, we know this. But you know what else was great? The Artorias of the Abyss DLC, which was released just over a year later. Was it better than the base game? Well, to be honest, I'm not sure I'd say it was, all in all, but it was sick, to say the least, and it gave us one of, in my opinion, the greatest boss fights that FromSoft have ever crafted, with the titular knight Artorias. I love him. Whether or not you loved Dark Souls 1's singular expansion though, one thing that could not be fairly claimed was that it was just some quick cash grab by the company to capitalise on the runaway success of their cult classic. Rather, it was quite clearly a quality cut of content, capiche? Then we had Dark Souls 2, which dropped just a year and a half later, and we're not going to go into that whole thing, but suffice to say, some people think it's good, and some people do not. Okay? I myself loved Dark Souls 2 back then, and I for one wanted more of this sort of thing. Didn't have to wait long at all either, because just 4 months after it came out we got our first DLC, and then another one the month after that, and then the third and final one another month after that. And guess what? They were bloody brilliant, all three of them, introducing top tier bosses like Sir Elon, the Fume Knight and Burnt Ivory King, giving us fresh and interesting level mechanics to play with, and supplying us with a wealth of wild new weapons and awesome armour sets. Sure, there was a certain degree of shit mixed into the Dark Souls 2 DLC cake, but just like in real life, as long as there's not too much shit mixed into the chocolate cake, I will eat it, and then ask for seconds and perhaps even thirds. I'm not going to exhaustively go through all of FromSoft's games and their DLCs here, rather I just want to get across that for as excellent and outstanding as their games are, their DLCs are always, at worst, just as good or even better. Experiences to get damn hyped about, maybe even just as excited as you would be for a brand new game. I mean, take Bloodborne's The Old Hunters. It's pretty much the best thing ever. I mean, Jesus, it really is the good stuff, a true masterwork, and while, in my view, Dark Souls 3's The Ringed City did not surpass Bloodborne's The Old Hunters, you've still got to give it its due as an explosive, apocalyptic, dark-drenched trek to the end and edge of the world, culminating in arguably the Dark Souls trilogy's best boss fight. Of course, after Dark Souls 3, we received the gracious gift of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, but for as tight, polished, punchy and impactful as that game was, no DLC. Many of us waited for news of new content in the months and then years after that game dropped, but other than the gauntlets and a few admittedly fantastic remixed bosses, we did not get an actual expansion for Sekiro, but we did get Elden Ring. Or at least we got a trailer for it in June of 2019, and then just like that, nearly 3 years later it came out. Folks, I absolutely love Elden Ring. I was awestruck by that very first trailer, and when I heard that George R.R. Martin was involved, I became even more excited because I'm a massive fan of A Song of Ice and Fire. In fact, that is my all-time favourite book series. But on top of that, turned out that Elden Ring was going to be open world, causing me to collapse to the ground and begin shaking and trembling and pissing myself. Violent spasms of ecstasy and excitement racking my body as I considered the ramifications of what I was hearing. It's going to be like Dark Souls, except in a big massive open world. It's going to be like Dark Souls, but bigger. Well, yes, that is what we got. That's actually exactly what we got, with the game looking and feeling particularly similar to Dark Souls 3, albeit with the addition of the jump. But there's so much more to Elden Ring than that, folks. The lands between was and is such a compelling environment to explore, a shattered land of lost and broken gods, brimming with beauty, reward and adventure, but an equal share of horror, decay and death, or should I perhaps say undeath. It wasn't just the world that was bigger either, no, hehehe. Everything was amplified, supersized and multiplied. More enemies than ever, more bosses, bigger, grander, more ambitious levels, more weapons, spells and skills, and the difficulty was now on a whole new level, inevitably evoking complaints from some who cried, "No, oh god no, it's too hard," in response to the likes of Malekith, Mohg, and of course... In fact, I'm sure there must have been quite a lot of people who took on Malenia and thought, well, there's no way it can get harder than this. I'll be honest, cards on the table here. My own first playthrough of Elden Ring wasn't the best. I also thought it was really hard, and by the time I got to crumbling Faram as Eula, I was quite fatigued at dying umpteen times to every boss before I eventually had their moveset drilled into me just enough so that I could scrape a victory. In fact, by the time I got to Mohg, Malenia and the final gauntlet of bosses in Leyndell, I wasn't really having any fun, and I kinda just wanted the game to end. Didn't even beat Malenia legit first time round. Instead, I got all pissy and chose to summon for help. Even the novelty of the shockingly huge open world started to dim for me towards the end, and I think a reason for that is just how overwhelming it all is to take in a single playthrough. It's like being served a big delicious meal, a lasagna, let's say, that you've been looking forward to all day, but then you try and eat it all in just a few bites. Yes, the lasagna is delicious, a beefy, cheesy treat that cannot be beat, but if you try and fit it inside yourself in the one go, then that's not coming out fun for anyone. I'm not great at analogies, but I hope you understand. Indeed, after letting my first impressions of Elden Ring cool off for a good month after playthrough number 1, I began playthrough number 2, but this time I took my time, exploring more thoroughly, trying out different weapons and playstyles and endeavouring to stare down every frightful demigod, knight and dragon that the bloody game threw at me. No summoning phantoms, no spirit ashes, and I didn't even use any sorcery or incantations. Not saying that that's the correct way to play or anything, but what I am saying is that this second cycle was far more enjoyable for me. No late game fatigue this time, and I only found myself becoming more enchanted with the Lands Between and its golden lore. Since then, I've played through the game a ton more times, even did a level 1 All Remembrances run, though to be honest that was hellish. It was miserable, and I never actually managed to beat Malenia despite me attempting her for literally about 25 hours over one weekend. I don't want to talk about that though, it's a very painful memory. But whilst people were replaying Elden Ring on New Game Plus and beyond, or doing challenge runs, or interpreting the lore, heck, even on day 1, inevitably lots of us were thinking, DLC though? Before Sekiro would have just been a given that we were getting more content, because even though Demon's Souls had never gotten an expansion, everything afterwards had up until Sekiro, which put a bit of doubt in my mind as to whether or not we'd get something extra for Elden Ring. FromSoft hardly bloody helped matters either, with their typical tendency to keep painfully quiet about upcoming projects. We all remember the near intolerable silence on Elden Ring after it was first announced in 2019. Well, of course, as usual, we got nothing for a f***ing year. Diddly squat, as you Americans say, or hee-haw, as we Scottish say. But after that year of waiting, what we did get was this. Hey, pretty damn cool. There's Miquella, and she's riding Mr. Horse. There are these interesting decrepit arched structures throughout this ghostly grassy plain, and most strikingly of all, there's a new tree here. Not the Erdtree or the Hailey tree, but something else. Something darker, and indeed, the upcoming DLC was to be called Shadow of the Erdtree. Oh my god. I was so excited at the possibilities. Where's it going to be set? How big is it going to be? Will there be new weapon classes? Will there be even harder bosses than Malenia? What's the story going to be, and how will it tie into the existing game story? Is there going to be a ton more consumables and pots and stuff for me to craft and then literally never use ever? Please let there be even more fights against dogs, rats, crabs and dragons. I was filled with questions and curiosities, but perhaps most pertinently of all, I wondered, when's it coming out? For Dark Souls 1, we had to wait a whole year. For Dark Souls 2, we had all 3 DLCs out within just 7 months. For Bloodborne, just 8 months. And then for Dark Souls 3, 7 months for the first DLC, and then the Ringed City dropped just 5 months after that. Well, I remember saying, it's already been a year since the base game came out from Soft, so not long now, eh? Blessedly, I was absolutely correct, because just like that, a year later we got our first trailer, and then 4 months after that, finally on the 21st of June 2024, the Shadow of the Erdtree was released. It's now been over 3 months since that time, and all the big YouTubers have long since released their reviews and analyses and critiques and whatnot on the DLC, and whilst there's certainly been a great deal of praise, there's been quite a lot of grumbling too. The Shadow of the Erdtree did not release to unanimous glowing praise. In fact, even at the time of writing, it's sitting with mixed recent reviews on Steam. Visiting any YouTube comment section or Reddit thread regarding the game, if you can manage to stay on Reddit for longer than 5 minutes without throwing up, quickly reveals that a lot of people have many of the same common complaints, though one does sometimes wonder to what degree people's opinions are shaped and influenced by what everybody else is saying. Me myself personally, I haven't made a proper video for a wee while now, because I have a regular job again, meaning I'm no longer reliant on YouTube to make a living, which is a good thing, because whilst quitting your job to focus on YouTube full time when you're 31 years of age may seem like a great idea at the time, you might just wake up 9 months later and think, hold on, that wasn't a good idea, I'm extremely depressed and I have no prospects. But, like I said, I'm doing fine now, and now I only have to make a video when I want to make a video, and indeed I do, now that the initial frantic rush to get out content has passed, so that I too can add my dumb opinions onto the pile also, so that I can discuss this much awaited expansion for Elden Ring. This video won't really have any overarching point or statement to make, but rather it's just a big fun discussion slash review slash critique slash analysis on the DLC's lore, gameplay, design, exploration, levels, bosses, etc. Though I would like to state right from the outset that I absolutely am in the camp that likes Shadow of the Erdtree. I think it's great, but certainly not perfect, so I will be honest about the things I did like and the things I did not. For clarity, all my gameplay footage is from New Game Plus 1 and Plus 2, and almost all of it was taken prior to patch 1.14. Anyway, this intro's gone on for way too long already, you must be furious. So let's crack right on with it, shall we? Just as many players rightly suspected, the key to the DLC is secreted within Mohgwyn Palace. It's the Cocoon of the Empyrean. After finishing Elden Ring for the first time, near everyone still had burning questions about many aspects of the game's story. If you were anything like me, you had absolutely no idea what the story even was, not least of all because of how difficult it was to keep track of the bloody demigods' names, and certainly not least of all because about half of them also had pseudonyms. But arguably the biggest and most baffling mystery of all was Miquella, who we only briefly see in the opening sequence, being spirited away by Mohg. For a character who we never truly meet, Miquella is a hugely significant figure in the lands between, being one of Marika / Radahnn's cursed children, and the architect and nourishing agent behind the Erdtree. The enormous but ultimately stunted and inferior rival to the Erdtree, located far across the sea to the north. Sure, Miquella is referenced in several item descriptions and by Malenia when we face her in Elfale at the Erdtree's roots, but we neither fight nor face him. That is, until making it to Mohgwyn Palace, where the Dark Omen demigod, Mohg, after rising from a pool of blood spilled from some large, grotesquely withered hand, splayed out from a cocoon, turns and addresses the diminished being within as none other than...
Dearest Miquella.
It's a hell of a shock, and I personally found it to be very disturbing. Just the contrast between this tiny golden-haired person and whatever the hell this orphan of cause looking thing is. The frustrating aspect of it, however, was that after the Mohg fight, you couldn't do anything else here. Sure, you could look, but you couldn't touch, and frankly it was painful. God, I wanted to know more. There must be more. So, Mohg took Miquella whilst he was within the roots of the Erdtree. Okay, but why does he look so monstrous here, especially in comparison to how he looks in this image where he's clearly just being godnapped by Mohg? It's not always a given that FromSoft will answer lore questions in DLCs. Sometimes they present you with even more questions and leave you more confused, but this time the mystery was not to be left as such, but is instead the core of the Shadow of the Erdtree's story, with the Cocoon of the Empyrean containing the withered remains of Miquella serving as the warp point into the realm of Shadow. Like I'm sure many people did, I'd started up a fresh playthrough in anticipation of the DLC coming out, and played through nearly the whole game before release day, though gotta say, this warp point is very far in. It can take a first time player like 80 hours or likely even longer before they'll make it to Mohg, though it really doesn't take too long to fast track it here on New Game Plus if you go through Varys questline. There's a brand new NPC here just outside the Cocoon, and I got damn excited when I saw her standing there. Couldn't believe we finally had new content after nearly 2.5 years, oh my god. This character's name is Needle Knight Leda, and as quickly becomes clear, she is a fiercely loyal follower of Miquella, or as she puts it, kindly Miquella. Not entirely dissimilar to how shortly before his demise, Mohg addressed the seemingly slumbering demigod as Dearest Miquella, and indeed you hear the demigod addressed in similar fashions by the DLC's other characters. At first, this simply seems like some adorable deific term of endearment. However, the next time Leda is encountered, she will let on that such affection is at least partially artificial, being the result of Miquella's charm. Not charm in the pedestrian sense, but in the magical sense. Indeed, we already know from the existence of the Bewitching Branch item, craftable from Sacramental Bud and Miquella's Lily, that the common affection afforded to Miquella by others is not organic, but rather is at least partially a product of manipulation, and Miquella's adorable childlike appearance no doubt plays a part in this. Aww. Ugh. Although his husk remains in this realm, Leda reveals that Miquella now dwells in what's known as the Realm of Shadow, seemingly a different place entirely from the Lands Between. It's not the first time that FromSoft have played about with different realms / dimensions / layers either, of course. Bloodborne in particular played heavily with such themes. Indeed, touching the withered arm of Miquella somehow warps us to the Realm of Shadow, though surprisingly there's no real fanfare here, nothing like Manos grabbing us through a portal or getting crushed and transported by the Lesser Amygdala. Rather, after a loading screen, we simply find ourselves in a new mysterious land, though if anything, the moment where we exit from the darkness and into the light here is even more impactful than that first time stepping out into green, grassy Limgrave, because instead of the glorious golden body of the Erdtree standing mightily far and high in the distance, we have the bent, blackened form of the Shadow Tree, dripping thick golden sap from up and along its twisted trunk, with translucent ethereal veils hanging down from its heavenly heights and out into the farthest corners of these Shadowlands. Perhaps just as notable as the Shadow Tree is the nature of the distant and surrounding landscape. One of the most defining attributes of the Lands Between was how broken up and uneven it all was. Sections featuring any semblance of extensive flatness were fairly rare, though there are a few places, Liurnia's shallow lake for example. The geomorphology between the different regions was of course very distinct. Compare the central lake and surrounding highlands in Liurnia to the rancid swampy expanses of Caelid with its hills and landmasses composed of blooming rot flora. Then there were the elevation differences. Of course, you had Alta's Plateau, which was substantially higher than Liurnia directly below it, with the consecrated snowfields being situated a good deal above that, and then at the absolute highest level stood the snow-capped mountaintops of the Giants. And let's not forget the underground sections, which themselves had their own different degrees of verticality. We all remember gazing false skyward towards Nokron from the Siofra River depths, and then a bit higher still in the direction of Mogwyn Palace. Point is, shit was all over the place, and that made it all cool and interesting to uncover and explore. Well, upon stepping out into the DLC's opening region, Gravesite Plain, it is quickly apparent that this realm's landscape will be just as, if not more, erratically and dramatically situated. Even the immediate plains are surrounded by much higher cliff sections, some of which you won't be accessing until a good bit later on. I remember spotting this ominous gravebird staring ominously down at me from above. It was just all ominous and stuff. And then hours after, when I was on my merry way eastwards to the jagged peak, I chanced upon and then duly whacked that very same feathered friend with a hefty pot. F you, bird brain. Honestly, my immediate first impressions were very complimentary. I was complimenting the game constantly while playing it, alone in my room. Aesthetically and atmospherically, the Gravesite Plain makes for an excellent vibe establisher, particularly when coupled with its soundtrack, the ideal aural accompaniment for galloping through this rolling sea of grass and graves in search of the divine. Yet another sight looming fairly far off, though certainly within galloping distance, is the DLC's first furnace golem, one of 8 in fact. We'd briefly seen one of these blazing behemoths in the first gameplay trailer, but from those exciting snippets alone, it really wasn't clear what sort of foe this was going to be. A major boss? Minor boss? Mini boss? Micro boss? Nano boss? What's the next one down? A Pico boss? Pikachu? This is good stuff, folks. Me myself personally, as a person, although I did fanny around just a bit in Gravesite Plain, visiting the Scorched Ruins located early on for some simple combat and a neat new talisman, of course, my eyes were drawn to the golem. How could they not be? This wicked wicker giant with its horned claws, smouldering furnace, and that dreadful visage, one which looks rather similar to the medallion hanging from the Dung Eater's omen armour, except featuring curved horns radiating outward rather than it being intended to resemble a sun. The most disturbing aspect of the furnace golems, and one which is only fully noticeable upon getting closer to them, is the fact that the material keeping them aflame is in fact flesh, bodies, those of humans, horses and even dragons. FromSoft have featured similar creatures before, of course, like the Rotten from Dark Souls 2, the Karthus Sandworm from Dark Souls 3, and the One Reborn from Bloodborne, with that latter entity being one of the most disgusting designs they've ever came up with. It has too many feet for my liking. Even though the Furnace Golem certainly isn't as gory or fleshy as those other designs though, I find it to be the most disturbing one of them all. It's not really alive in a proper sense, but rather is an automaton giving life through some fell enchantment. There are places where you can even find scrapped golems that have either been destroyed or decommissioned. Got a wee bit worried when I first tried whacking one of these things in the foot, as I saw the respectable damage numbers I was doing compared to how little its health actually went down. Thought maybe this was going to be one of those enemies I would need to come back to much later on when I was more buff, but nah. Although it is possible to defeat it strictly by hacking endlessly at its legs, the trick is in this stagger, 3 of which will topple it to the ground, allowing you to deliver a critical to the visage for insane damage, though got to go through this whole rigmarole of knocking it down a couple of times. For some reason I instinctively assumed it was optimal to always be on torrent for these battles, but turns out that for the most part it's actually fine to fight their feet whilst on foot. I found it much easier to land more rapid strikes while dehorsed. You have access to your fancy Ashes of War, and I actually preferred dodging their fire stomps with regular jumps compared to torrent's leaps. The former seems to be more based on iframes, whereas when you're on torrent it seems to be based more on how well you physically clear the ground fire when airborne. Or maybe I'm just talking out my ass, I don't know, I don't make games, I play them. I do think their fire stomps are extremely cool though, mechanically simple, sure, but very aesthetically impactful and massively dangerous. My favourite golem is in Shadow Atlas, because there's a ton of tents and debris around, not to mention actual enemies, which get incinerated by the wide-reaching heat blasts. Even after getting confident with the timings, I still felt that tension after each monumental stomp, and their jumping double stomps were terrifying. I don't think I ever survived one of these when hit, and dying against a Furnace Golem means an awful lot of hacking, slashing and jumping all over again. Indeed, I've heard some folks say that they found these fights to get very boring rather quickly, and while I see what they mean and even agree to some extent, I still got excited when I saw one, especially across some great distance. They also acted as markers for regions I hadn't yet reached and often didn't even know how the hell to get to, and furthermore additional attacks and mechanics do get added into the mix. The first golem in Gravesite Plain largely just swipes, kicks and stomps, but the next one I encountered in Elak River mixed it up with a swirling fireball attack that absolutely did necessitate frantic manoeuvring with Torrent, and I believe every other golem apart from the first one can also pull out this attack. Not actually a big fan of it though, because you pretty much have to just stop attacking and run away and hope it won't keep spamming it, which they sometimes will, regardless of how close you are to it. It's annoying when the Erdtree avatars did it, and it's annoying when you do it too, Mr. Golem. The most extravagant and impressive of its attacks has to be the forward fire vortex. Didn't quite understand what I was even doing the first time I saw one kneel down in the distance, but yeah, it turns out it's a Proud Claude from FF7 type thing, but it's gearing up for its special move. You can even make use of this in the ancient runes of Rau by baiting it into nailing of the Shadow Hornsent for a ton of easy runes. The biggest mix-up of all with these big boys though are the armoured variants, where you cannot deal damage to their legs at all, nor stagger them. First such one I encountered was beyond the forest, which leads to the Cathedral of Manus Meter, and the church district at Shadowkeep, and folks, it had me absolutely flummoxed. Tried attacking the legs and it did nothing, though I did notice a developer message on the ground, reading, "Their legs are made of sterner stuff. Try lighting a fire in their bellies instead." Eh? Lighting a fire in their bellies? They're already on fire though. You want me to light them on fire even more? And their bellies? Where's its f***ing belly? The furnace is on top. Tried using the nearby spirit spring and then tempting it over once it was done spamming the big fireball attack, but nothing seemed to be working and I couldn't figure out what the game wanted me to do. Well, turns out that if I'd headed north first at Shadow Altus instead of east, near a destroyed furnace golem, I would have found a note strongly indicating that fire pots, and in particular furnace pots, are the key to beating these sturdier malefactors. Gotta toss them directly into the furnace, hence try lighting a fire in their bellies. I appreciated the change in formula, though at the same time it was kind of annoying. I hadn't actually found the crafting recipe for furnace pots yet, and so I had to just look it up, except I only had 2 hefty cracked pots, and turned out that wasn't enough to finish it off, and regular fire pots and even giant's flame pots weren't doing shit, so just had to come back later to nail it then when I was sufficiently potted up. Cool detail about hefty furnace pots by the way is that they actually resemble furnace golems. Of course, one of the materials needed to craft one is a furnace visage, but the pots even have those grasping hand-like appendages extending over the top. Cool shit, and all the cooler when you land one right in its belly, for the largest chunk of damage I've ever delivered in one fell blow, to this fell giant. Hadn't planned on talking about furnace golems for all this time, but there you go. I mentioned that the main continually combusting material contributing to their morbid blaze is in fact humans, but more specifically, the victims here are Hornsent. The Hornsent are, or perhaps more accurately, were, the main inhabitants of the Realm of Shadow. This is their home. Very soon upon entering the DLC will you see living Hornsent travelling around in packs, though strictly speaking, living is not the correct verb to use here. This land is called the Realm of Shadow, and indeed, almost all the Hornsent you see, as well as their dogs, regrettably, have been reduced to mere shadows. Lost souls aimlessly roaming through not only the Gravesite Plain, but nearly everywhere else in this world too. Although their size and shape don't look too dissimilar to that of regular humans, the difference is that they tend to have horns sprouting from their head, though it seems to be more accurate to think of the Hornsent as being a culture, religion and or way of life, rather than them being a separate race of their own. And indeed, some Hornsent don't sport horns at all. It's all down to the primordial, unknowable influence of the ever enigmatic Crucible. Of course, as we know, in the lands between, horns are considered abhorrent. because they are looked upon as effectively being marks of the Crucible, marks which harken back to a time before the Erdtree, the Golden Order, and Queen Marika's eternal reign. This is why omens are shunned, mutilated and slaughtered, why the misbegotten are so ill-treated, and why Godfrey's Crucible Knights were made outcasts, scattered to all corners of the lands between. It's because they exhibited physical aspects such as wings, scales, tails, and above all, horns, ominous curved, curled horns, for example, such as can be seen growing out of the Dung Eater's foul seedbed curses, not to mention his infinitely fouler mending rune of the Fell Curse. Here though, the horn is the norm. In this realm, there is no Erdtree, only its twisted shadow. By the way, I know I wasn't alone in blinking questioningly the first time I saw the word Erdtree. It was still the very start of the experience, and so I was still in full enchantment mode, but even so I did think to myself, Erdtree, huh? That's a clumsy name which really doesn't roll off the tongue, especially my clumsy Scottish tongue. Day-to-day diction is already a big enough struggle for me without throwing Erdtree my way. But turns out Skadu simply means shade or shadow in Old English, and it's pronounced Shadu rather than Skadu, or worse, Skadu, which is fortunate because Erdtree is a very cool name. Back to the Hornsent though, see, although this land is their home, indeed there aren't any to be found in the lands between, and nor are there any references to them in the base game as far as I'm aware, but although this is their home, a prolonged, brutal and burning crusade has annihilated their numbers. You can quickly see evidence of this in the scorched ruins in south central gravesite plain, presumably having been rendered thus by the nearby furnace golem, or perhaps just by a group of knights and soldiers of the crusade, leaving desolate crowds of umbral Hornsent pouring over the ashen remains of their desecrated settlement, though it seems that those killed by furnace golems themselves would likely not end up as one of these lost souls, because as the item description for the hefty furnace pot reads, the furnace's flame burns away both body and soul. When impurity is thus expunged, one calls it cleansing, annihilation essentially. As for why this crusade is taking place, well, that's something we'll get into later, but as for who is commanding it, his name starts appearing very early on. In fact, he's the cover boy for the DLC, Messmer. That very first image we got in 2022 showed Miquella atop Torrent, gravesite plain and the Erdtree, sure, but things heated up far more compared to that placid picture when Messmer's pale, unsettling form and flames were revealed in the first gameplay trailer, with further violent scenes of he and his loyal legions laying waste to the inhabitants, settlements and divine beasts of the Realm of Shadow in the story trailer from back in May. Messmer is a demigod, progeny of Radahn, as evidenced by his distinctive fire-red hair, and the wanton strumpet Marika, as the Hornsent Grandom so colourfully puts it. Incredible dialogue and voice acting, by the way. My previous favourite old lady in a FromSoft game was the stone-humped hag overlooking the Dreg Heap in Dark Souls 3, but I think this crooning crone is my new queen. Same actress as the woman who played Brad Pitt's mum in the movie Snatch, by the way. And might I also be so bold as to say how chuffed I am for the Irish. That we got not one, not two, but 3 new excellent Irish accented characters for the DLC, and damn bloody good ones too. Anyway, what the hell was I speaking about? Oh yeah, Messmer. He's the one leading the crusade, and his soldiers are to be found all throughout the Realm of Shadow, standing guard within camps, sitting by fires, stationed within keeps, castles and forts, and even doing battle with other of the realm's inhabitants, like the Blood Fiends, a monstrous tribe who worship the Formless Mother. Elden Ring has never been a game to shy away from depicting horror and brutality, and indeed, wherever Messmer's followers are, you will find evidence of merciless slaughter. A perfect example is along the Elac Great Bridge and outside Castle Ensis, where innumerable blackened corpses are cruelly skewered on long spears, some of them still smouldering and smoking. The act of impaling is not coincidental either, because Messmer's full moniker in the Realm of Shadow is Messmer the Impaler, and as well as the demigod's signature style of execution, he also has his own distinctive type of fire. Messmer fire. I've always loved all the different flavours of elements in Elden Ring. I mean, with lightning there's yellow lightning, red lightning, and ice lightning, and with fire there's regular fire, giant's flame, ghost flame, black flame, blood flame, frenzy flame, and now Messmer fire. And hey, there's even Bayle's flame lightning, which is a furious fusion of the two. It's all so sick. Some of these types have their own special effects of course, like how Ice Lightning causes frost buildup, Blood Flame causes bleed buildup, and Black Flame drains health and max HP after the initial impact, but Messmer Fire is essentially just an extra powerful version of regular fire, with its own distinctive appearance, whether it's being thrown out by the demigod himself, by his fire knights, or even his attack dogs, which are constantly burning with it. The special thing about Messmer Fire, however, is that it originates from within himself, always burning away inside Messmer's body and soul. You can even find smouldering embers of it near his camps, which can be used to craft fire coils, fire sprite stones, and furnace pots. Although there are no adverse status effects associated with it, Messmer Fire is a pain in the arse to deal with it, but in a way that I love, and you can quote me on that. Candle Type 1A loves pain in his ass. You'll be most thoroughly faced with this exquisite anal agony when facing off against the Fire Knights, but as most fire attacks used by you or enemies go roughly where you aim them right as they're cast, some enemies in the DLC use attacks where a fireball is summoned, but the propulsion is delayed, and I don't know about anyone else, but it catches me out nearly every damn time. Even on my third round through the DLC, I kept getting tricked, especially because the fireballs are very fast, meaning trying to avoid them with clever manoeuvring just doesn't work like with other projectiles. Got to use cover or time the roll, and often even more delayed rolls immediately after as successive fireballs are summoned. It's very clever and tricky. It plays into the distinctive theme of the fire too, which seems to have near a life of its own. Indeed, the item description for the Ember of Messmer ingredient reads, Serpentine cord-like ember, remnant of Messmer's flame, the symbol of the Crusade. It continues to smoulder as if crawling across the ground. Messmer Fire has a slithering, serpentine nature that no other fire type in the game has, and you can see this vividly in this clip of the story trailer as his fire dances and snakes through the sky, mimicking the motions of the pair of slender winged serpents draped around his very body and, as we'll see later, the form of the abyssal serpent deep within his body, forever sustained by his unquenchable inner flame. I'll be talking more about the lore and story of the DLC throughout the video, but for now I'd like to dip into the gameplay side of things. One of the many things I was curious as hell about when coming into Shadow of the Erdtree was difficulty. I thought, well, things got pretty damn hard by the end of the base game in levels like Elfale and Farama's Eula, so how are FromSoft going to handle the transition from endgame difficulty and intensity levels back to an early game feel for the start of the DLC? Well, in addition to my early encounters with the Furnace Golem, there was a certain other enemy situated very early on that made me think, uh-oh, I might not be ready for this. I'm talking about the Curseblade who pirouettes down from a stone arch, armed with a pair of sucks for both slashing and throwing. When playing these games, many of us have been known to, at times, punch the air violently and thrash our feet wildly in frustration when faced with some obnoxious enemy who just won't stop attacking. The older games have a bunch of examples too, for sure, but Elden Ring goes way harder when it comes to enemies of that nature. Royal Revenants, anyone? Well, Curse Blades, while perhaps not being quite as chaotic and messy as the likes of the Royal Revenants or Grafted Scions, are absolutely designed to create intense pressure and elicit panic. And just when it dashes away and you think you've got a second or two to heal, no, it sends some projectiles at you with its damn feet. Got absolutely slashed into submission on my first few attempts at this dude. It seems to me that FromSoft placed this enemy at the start here specifically so as to shock any cocky overleveled players into a stunned silence, as if to say, oh, you think you're ready for this DLC, big boy? What are you, the big cheese around town? Think you're gonna waltz in here and destroy every new enemy in sight? No. Over on the western edge of Gravesite Plain, you can also find a nameless mausoleum, one of 4 in fact, with each corresponding to a cardinal direction and containing an NPC type boss encounter, all sporting unique gear. Not only that though, but they can be distractingly challenging. Just like the Curse Blade, the Black Jail Knight blew my back out more times than I care to recall. Not just because of his fancy fully automatic crossbow or his air projectile slash, which kinda reminds me of a similar move from Demon Souls' King Allant, but also because of his bloody health and damage output, which again made me think that the standard of difficulty had been substantially elevated, even in comparison to the base game's later levels. Over the first week or two of the DLC's release, I saw a lot of grumbling online that it was too hard, and that it probably needed to be made easier. How difficult you find something is of course also relative to your own tastes and skill level and whatnot, but in my opinion, no, the DLC really ain't too hard, and it never was. And that's not coming from someone who considers themselves to be a particularly great gamer. I admit freely and often that I'm quite average. Rather, I think a lot of the complaints are based on a particular few encounters that are substantially harder than anything else in the DLC, which, for some people, are so egregiously challenging that their very presence renders the overall feel of the experience into something they find disconcertingly difficult. It's like if you have a fairly large dataset, but there are a few data points which drastically skew the average to the upside. They're not mistakes or anything, and they do truly belong in that dataset just as much as everything else, but if you were to remove them, the average would be far lower. I knew that advanced Excel course would pay off eventually. If I had to sum up the difficulty of Shadow of the Erdtree, I would say it's mostly appropriately and intelligently challenging, with some parts feeling a bit too easy, and with a few instances where the difficulty admittedly can flash to the extreme. Yes, I'm talking about the final boss, obviously. He's off the charts hard, or at least he was before patch 1.14. And Rellana can be a royal terror on your first playthrough too, same with Bayle, though that's only if you decide not to summon Egon, otherwise he's not too tough. Generally speaking, I actually found the experience to feel pretty damn smooth difficulty wise. Rather than those early encounters with the Curse Blade and the Black Jail Knight setting the tone for the entire experience, they ended up feeling far more like ice cold splashes of water to the face to get my arse in gear, after which I felt that conditions did calm down somewhat, though an aspect that helped smooth things out is the new progression system. I was very curious to see how FromSoft would handle progression here, especially considering how leveled up most folk booting up their old save files were likely to be. Nioh 2, for example, a game I absolutely love, upped its stat level caps from 99 all the way to 200 throughout its DLC cycle, as well as adding in things like ethereal weapons and other bonuses and stuff. And while Nioh 2 is a rather different game to Elden Ring, still just made me wonder how the ante was going to get upped here. Higher level smithing stones maybe? Are you going to be able to get to plus 50 now? And plus 20 somber weapons? How much is that going to cost? Well, there is a new system in place, but it goes beyond just higher levels and further reinforced weapons. It's the blessing system. You guys gotta try this new system. Scattered all around the realm of Shadow are Shadow Tree fragments, which can be used at sites of grace to buff up your character, and similarly, revered spirit ashes buff up your spirit phantoms. These buffs are significant too. At the max blessing level of 20, you will be dealing just over 2x damage and taking just under 50% of incoming damage, though the incremental benefits between one level and the next were altered with patch 1.12.2. At launch, it was just a straight 5% damage increase on top of baseline damage output with every blessing level, but post-patch you now get heavily diminishing returns past level 12. In fact, the percentage damage increase between levels 12 to 20 is now just the same as the increase between levels 10 to 12, and the percentage of damage reduced is similarly weighted more heavily at those earlier levels, and in my opinion, this is an improvement. As anyone who's played this game will know, finding those last bunch of fragments can be a real drag. It's the same as with any game where you're trying to collect all of a certain thing. It's great fun at first because you're seeing a bunch of them, but gradually they become scarcer, and as you start encountering them less, you get conscious that you're still nowhere near to collecting them all, and you're running out of places to look. Eventually, you seem to have been just about everywhere, but there's still a bunch more fragments to find. Well, you could just say screw it and give up. You could wander the world once again and try extra hard to spot the remaining few still to be found, or you could simply look it up online, which, as well as not really feeling rewarding or even fun, can still be a hassle, because chances are you don't remember every one you've already found, and so will have to work your way down the list visiting spots you've already been to just to make absolutely sure you've definitely already picked up that fragment. By the time I'd gotten to the last boss, I believe I was around blessing level 15, 14, just because I wasn't interested in the grind to find the rest of them. Nice thing though is that they do all respawn in New Game Plus and can still be used, so very easy to get to max blessing level after your first playthrough without you having to find every single unique one, at every cross, in every pot, and at every tutelary deity. I've watched people play through the DLC with 0 blessings and it looks beyond brutal. Not strictly from a damage point of view, because there are always ways and workarounds to deal big damage in Elden Ring regardless of self-imposed restrictions, but because of how fragile your character is, you pretty much always need to be at full health, otherwise you're in real danger of being 2 or even one-shotted. I don't quite have the stomach for attempting a no blessing run myself yet, but once I've been round the ringer a few more times and I'm in a masochistic sort of mood one weekend, maybe I'll give it a shot. Or not. I have only done New Game Plus runs after my original playthrough, and so I only had to engage in the fragment hunt on my first playthrough and then a little bit on my second till I got to level 20, though I'm sure it is a bit annoying to have to find most of the fragments all over again on every fresh playthrough instead of just being able to play through the DLC normally. Kinda seems like more of a problem for speed and challenge runner types who will be starting fresh runs several times a day though really, because it's not like you can easily and quickly start the DLC content with a new character. It's something of a bother to get to the Realm of Shadow unless you're on New Game Plus, and even if you do make a beeline for it by killing Radahn and doing Vari's questline, you're still going to be way under-leveled due to not having played through the base game fully. Kinda makes me wish that FromSoft did what The Witcher 3 did, where it allowed you to dive straight into the DLCs from the main menu without having to play through the base game every time, or at the very least, let us play against any boss at our leisure just as Sekiro later did. Back to the blessing system for a second though. An important catch with it is that the buffs are only active within the Realm of Shadow, which is understandable because damage and health really are ramped up for the DLC. Big time, baby! I mean, compare the HP of the Ultimate Dragon Boss in the DLC to the Ultimate Dragon Boss in the base game. Compare the HP of Commander Gaius, whom you fight around 60% of the way through the DLC, to say Morgott, who's fought around 60% of the way through the base game. That extra damage output and damage reduction simply isn't necessary for the base game. It would be overkill. Now, don't get me wrong, it'd be sick as hell to be casually dealing 2 and 3k damage to all and sundry throughout the lands between and all, and it definitely is a bit sad when you warp back there after spending a lot of time in the Realm of Shadow and all of a sudden your numbers are virtually cut in half. But all in all, I like the blessing system. It makes sense, it's more interesting than simply raising level and reinforcement caps to ever more ludicrous numbers, and it goes a long way towards making the difficulty transition into the DLC and difficulty curve within the DLC fairly smooth, at least until the last boss. Let's get on to other stuff now, like the nature of this new world. One of the most intriguing questions regarding the Realm of Shadow is, what exactly is it? Where is it? What's with this crazy looking tree? I don't know, you tell me. The Shadow Tree is a key landmark in a similar way to what the Erdtree is to the Lands Between, but what makes it seem even more otherworldly is the enormous set of veils hanging down from above it, which drape over and out into the land. I mean, the base game regions feature some outlandish skyboxes, especially with the way they change colour in different places. Compare Caelid's rolling red skies to Liurnia's glintstone blue skies. There were even subterranean false skies, but really nothing like these veils. They imbue this world with a fantastical dreamlike quality. At first I wondered like hell what they actually were, and to what extent they might have been there simply to make the Shadow Tree and the Realm of Shadow more visually striking, but this is From Software talking about here, and the details, particularly ones as vivid as these, are seldom there just for the hell of it. Well, these vast stretches of fabric seem to literally be what's keeping the Realm of Shadow hidden from the Lands Between. There are people who have fannied around with the maps so that the Realm of Shadow fits into the large body of water at the centre of the Lands Between's map, though I'm not sure just how much manipulation of scale and positioning is required to make the two land masses fit. The note at the top of the suppressing pillar located in Gravesite Plain does proclaim it to be the very centre of the Lands Between, heavily implying that we are in a sense still in the Lands Between, or that the Realm of Shadow was once a part of it, but via the obscuring magic of the veils somehow installed there by Queen Marika so as to render the Realm of Shadow little more than a distant memory, this place was forever isolated away, out of both sight and reach. I'm not sure what the facts are, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm qualified to have a truly deep discussion of this. I'll leave that to the scholars, like fellow Scotsman Smotown, but I just love the idea that the Realm of Shadow has been right there in the middle of the Lands Between this whole time, except hidden and inaccessible, or at least partially inaccessible, which brings us back to Miquella. I spoke about him earlier because indeed he's the dead looking being languishing in the cocoon of the Empyrean back at Mohg's palace, but he's also the central focus of the DLC, and as we know from Leda, he's now within the Realm of Shadow. Two things that are strange about that. 1. How can he be in the Realm of Shadow if he's right here? And 2. How did he get into the Realm of Shadow and simultaneously become a conduit into it if the place was supposed to have been completely sealed away? Well, for as much as I wish it did, the game does not directly answer either of these questions. God damn it. But the key to this translocation seems to be tied to Lord Mohg's cursed blood and his allegiance to the Formless Mother. We know that Mohg stole away Miquella from within the roots of the Erdtree, which he was nourishing with his own Empyrean blood. You can even see here that Miquella is covered in some silky, webby looking substance, clearly having just been removed from within the tree. It was the logical assumption here that Mohg was solely doing this for his own selfish ends, and for the glory of his coming dynasty, to become his half-brother's consort and make use of his Empyrean power. However, in light of later revelations around Miquella's nature and his extended plans for the Omen demigod, it seems more likely that Miquella bewitched him into kidnapping him, knowing that he himself would end up in Mohg's palace for his body to be imbued and near rotted from Mohg's blood, and that is because this blood was the key to making it into the Realm of Shadow, blood accursed with the taint of the Formless Mother. One unique ability of Mohg and his sanguine nobles is that they can translocate using blood, to rise up from pools of the stuff through the enigmatic power of the Formless Mother. Perhaps it's specifically the Outer God's formless nature that allows for this. The term formless could be interpreted to mean different things. I mean, water could be called formless in that it doesn't have a specific shape, but it still has mass and tangibility. But formless could also mean something that has no form or mass whatsoever, no physical presence, only energy or spiritual energy. Guess that definition doesn't quite apply in the case of the Formless Mother when you consider the Blood Boon ritual skill, the description of which does describe it as piercing the body of the Formless Mother so as to make use of her eldritch blood, though precisely what is meant by her body, who knows. It might literally be just some divine sanguine sea drifting through the cosmos, reachable and usable only by her followers. What is known is that Miquella needed Mohg to get to the realm of shadow. Perhaps the bloody powers of his formless god is the one and only way to circumvent Marika's veils. All we are directly told regarding how Miquella makes it here is from Sir Ansbach, who simply states that Miquella used his lord to gain access to the land of shadow, and it's left to the player to work out the rest. It's very vague. As for how Miquella is both here in the Cocoon and in the realm of shadow, I don't know. I don't get it. As an Empyrean, Marika is a very powerful demigod, and we know that Empyreans can play about with their physical forms to some extent. Ranni abandoned hers entirely and would go on to inhabit the body of a doll, but this is different. Even if Miquella did manage to forgo his body and leave it behind in the Cocoon and carry on as a spirit of sorts in the realm of shadow, well, he actually can't have. In many key locations throughout the DLC, you will come across Miquella's crosses. Although not terribly large, their appearance certainly is eye-catching due to their golden coloration and because of the rune-shaped symbol it exhibits, a shape you yourself can playfully emulate with the Ring of Miquella gesture. See? The first one you see is at the 3-path cross site of grace in Gravesite Plain, containing the message, "I abandon here the first of the flesh of my body." There are a further 12 crosses also featuring similar messages, which testify to the abandonment of sections of Miquella's very flesh, and even some more metaphysical aspects of his being, like love and fear. I was a bit slow to realise it, but the messages on these crosses are to be taken literally, and by that I mean Miquella truly did remove parts of his body at these sites, as evidenced by the Empyrean blood burgeons which appear around them, divine shoots which only appear when the golden blood of Miquella has been spilled. I'll speak more about Miquella's journey and purpose in the realm of shadow towards the end of the video, but the point is that he's left behind his body in the lands between, and yet has another physical body here which he is gradually shedding, and it's just so unclear to me how that makes sense, other than just explaining it away with the fact that he's an Empyrean, which itself isn't a fully defined or understood concept. Perhaps the idea is that he's divided himself into two beings just like Marika did to create Radahn, but if that is the implication, then my god is it difficult to discern. I actually really liked the story of the Shadow of the Erdtree, but the logic of the lore of it did get quite strained and awkward at times, at least for a simpleton like me. Feel free to give your own theories and such in the comment section though. You know what, how about we ditch all that convoluted lore for a while and instead talk about exploration and levels and whatnot. That's one of the things we all look forward to with these games, ain't it? Especially when it comes to Elden Ring, a whole new open world to explore, new regions and dungeons and ruins to be cleared and conquered. Well, I'll say now that I do prefer the exploration and navigation found in the base game world over what's featured here in the DLC, and whilst I certainly did like the new Legacy dungeons, they didn't blow me away as much as I would have liked. That might sound surprising to some people because one of those new Legacy dungeons is Shadow Keep, which is quite a level to say the least, but for as much as I like and in some cases even love the new bosses, old levels like Stormvale Castle, Leyndell and Rhea Lucaria still reign supreme in my mind, though there certainly are a couple of respectable contenders here. First things first though, how's the open world? Well, it sure is pretty, that much simply cannot be denied, only a fool would deny this. I already described the magic of first stepping out into Gravesite Plain, of being struck by the forlorn majesty and scale of this lost land, not just of the immediate area but also the cliffs, peaks and structures far off in the distance. Although Gravesite Plain is a damn large region, there is a great deal of stylistic variation featured in the others to the north, east and south. Some of them can loosely be thought of as counterparts to base game locations like Gravesite Plain and Limgrave, Shadow Altus and Altus Plateau, Jagged Peak and Mount Gelmir have a similar aesthetic, and that's about it, to be honest. Let's not stretch the comparisons beyond the realms of accuracy. Locations like the ancient ruins of Rau and the Abyssal Woods really do have their own unique characters though, for better and for worse. An issue I sometimes ran into though was getting to these places. See, although the realm of Shadow is smaller than the lands between, I actually think its landscape is somewhat denser and more complex, and maybe that's got something to do with the differences in shape between the two worlds. Not saying that the lands between's layer is simple, because it isn't, but there's a vague sense of linearity with the fact that it's sort of horseshoe shaped, with the general direction of progress being clockwise from Limgrave, through Liurnia, into Altus Plateau, and then into the mountaintops of the Giants, before you're thrown into crumbling Faram Azula and then back to Leyndell. In addition to the above ground regions, you also had the underground ones, which you could argue greatly added to the complexity of the lands between even more, but I would disagree there. Although the land above and the one below are directly connected by elevators in a few places, they largely feel like their own distinct worlds, at least to me. You don't really need to keep track of where you are in relation to the world above whilst travelling underground, or vice versa. It's just more stuff to explore with different visual themes and types of terrain, sometimes only accessible via spatially disconnected coffins or portals from completely different places, like how you get to Mogwyn Palace at the southeast of the underground map via a portal located in the consecrated snowfields away to the north of the above ground map. The difference with the realm of Shadow, however, is that it is not a horse shoe. It more resembles the shape of a crab, or perhaps a lobster. Well, not really, I guess. Silliness aside, my point is that it's a big dense lump of land with no clear inherent linearity discernible just by looking at it. The vast majority of base game Elden Ring was skippable. I mean, you never even had to set foot in Caelid, and some place like, say, the Weeping Peninsula was very easily ignored. But the skippability is ramped up even more here. In fact, to beat the DLC, here are the only places you need to pass through in some capacity, though of course you won't know this on a first playthrough. The Realm of Shadow's shape makes everything feel a bit closer together, and this is made even more the case with the fact that there are no distinct above ground and underground maps now. Oh, there are elevation differences alright, substantial ones, both between the different regions and also within them, but it's all integrated into the one large layered world in a way that can be distractingly awkward to navigate, where it can be difficult as hell to work out how to get from one open world location to another, because lots of shit is stacked on top of other shit now. There were a few parts of the map that I remember looking at and just being baffled on how to actually get there, and I had to resort to looking stuff up at times, like the Rau base. I'd been through the ancient ruins of Rau already, but saw Rau base mentioned online somewhere, which I didn't even know was an actual place in the DLC. Turns out to get there you need to pass through this tucked away wee passage in Shadow Altus, which spits you out into a grave bird infested poison swamp, which then leads on to Rau base, far below the ancient ruins above. It's the kind of thing that would be a really cool surprise if you just chanced upon it, and hey, now it's led me to this whole new area to explore, but this also makes it all too easy to miss, and looking at the map to try and discern a route into it just doesn't work because there is no visible logical route here. Same with some place like Cerulean Coast. I did actually naturally discover that on my first playthrough, but again, in a way where it just sort of happened via random exploration, to the extent that even after I'd beaten the DLC and kicked off playthrough number 2, I couldn't remember at all how to get back there, and only found it by chance again whilst out exploring. Even now, after 3 playthroughs, as I sit here and type, I struggle to visualise the layouts and pathways between some of the regions of the Realm of Shadow in a way that I don't with the base game map. Now, granted, maybe that's because I've played through the base game a lot more over the course of years now, but even allowing for that, it was still my feeling that the world's a bit more awkward and even at times annoying to get around in now. More complex? Yes, but better, more enjoyable? I don't think so. As for the regions themselves, my opinions vary, though I generally did enjoy exploring them more than I enjoyed moving between them. Your large and especially open locations like Gravesite Plain and Shadow Altis don't really offer different experiences to what's already found in the base game, but there certainly are places which feel more fresh and different. The Stone Coffin Fissure located at the far south is one such place, though you can't actually enter it to begin with. Just as the Moonlight Altar and Leyndell are initially closed off by impassable seals in the base game, the same is true when descending down the southern Cerulean Donut, for lack of a better term, with the dreamy depths only being accessible once Miquella's Great Rune has broken, an important event I'll cover in more detail when I discuss the NPCs. Stone Coffin Fissure is a completely underground location, though recall that there isn't actually a separate underground map, and so when you activate a point of grace inside it, it just looks like you've done so in the middle of the sea as far as the map is concerned. Truly magnificent looking level, with the implication being that these giant putrescence filled coffins have migrated here from who knows where via who knows what bizarre natural mechanism. You can find loads of them above ground too throughout Cerulean Coast, usually with some high level grave glovewort at the top, like I didn't have enough of those in my inventory. Although it looks absolutely massive and just begging to be explored, the fissure is a wee bit deceptive in that it's surprisingly linear and you can't ride around on Torrent, and there's only one viable destination here, that being the final stone coffin below which the Putrescent Night boss fight takes place. I guess this place isn't all that unique, because we did have Nokron in the base game, which also required descending down ancient toppled structures, also possessing a distinctive, colourful, misty ambience. But regardless, Stone Coffin Fissure adds a nice sleepy pinch of flavour to the Shadow of the Erdtree experience, even if it probably looks more interesting than it feels to actually play. Sometimes it's more about the feel of a place, more than its technicality though. Another highlight is Jagged Peak. I mentioned that there were a few places that I had to look up how to actually reach, and believe it or not, Jagged Peak was one of them. Sounds silly, I know, I mean, look at it, it's fucking massive. But in my defense, the only way into it is through this one specific cave, which is preceded by an invader named Ancient Dragon Man, and which contains an NPC boss fight also named Ancient Dragon Man. Very creative. Jagged Peak itself, though, is an experience. It is not a normal region, but a ride, a soaring, stormy ascent. There are some regular enemies near the start, but not all that many, though there are a few dragon encounters which I have mixed opinions on, as I'll expand on later. Like Stone Coffin Fissure, Jagged Peak is also not really the sort of location that facilitates much exploration. Apart from a forked path near the beginning, it really is surprisingly linear, and for as ominous as the entire place looks, especially from a distance, it's not super challenging to actually get through, apart from the dragons, all of whom you can just ride straight past if you want, and perhaps even should in Senesax's case, because this fight stinks. Even if the act of actually scaling the peaks isn't very difficult, mostly involving riding spirit springs and climbing steep rocky terrain on Torrent, it's just all sick. It's fun as hell. This place looks and feels amazing, especially as the weather becomes more thunderous and windy closer to the top and you're riding over the corpses of fallen dragons, knowing that you're getting closer and closer to arguably the nastiest and gnarliest dragon that FromSoft have ever created. Even though it is on the mainland and is directly connected to Caro's hidden grave and to Gravesite Plain via Dragon's Pit, Jagged Peak still has this great feeling of geographic isolation, of feeling somewhat separate and unique to the rest of the map, and this effect only grows stronger the higher you climb, up and away from the rest of the world. All in all, super glad FromSoft included this place. It's something different and even a wee bit experimental with how tied the pacing is to the character of Egon. More on him later when I discuss Bayle in the boss section of the video. A couple of locations I've heard complaints about are Cerulean Coast and Carol's Hidden Grave, which is essentially just Cerulean Coast except red instead of blue. Whilst both locations do look beautiful, that brightly coloured flower aesthetic really does go a long way. Yeah, I guess they are a wee bit underwhelming, though I think a reason for that is that they feature no major bosses. Cerulean Coast contains one of the DLC's 4 Ghostland dragons and a demi-human queen, 3 of which were already in the base game, while Carol's Hidden Grave just has a Tibia Mariner and a Deathrite bird, which were both done to death, pun intended, in the base game. And there's another Furnace Golem here too, because why not? Cerulean Coast also repeats that same offshore island only accessible via an underground tunnel shtick that we already saw in Lingrave, which is fine, but it doesn't do much to make the place stand out in an interesting way from what we've already experienced. Even so, I do still enjoy both these locations well enough, not only for their beautiful aesthetics, but also because it's just more Elden Ring. They're kind of like smaller, prettier versions of the Weeping Peninsula, in that nothing all that major is to be found here, and they're optional, but hey, let's go anyway, there's still some fun stuff to do here. One of the things you can do whilst in Cerulean Coast is pay a visit to the Finger Ruins of Rhea, which lies adjacent to it, and at the other side of the map, the Finger Ruins of Dale can be reached from the Hinterlands. The DLC's 2 Finger Ruins are also places that have attracted some criticism, and that's because while they are incredible to look at and enormous in size, they are also ridiculously empty. I mean, seriously, it is impressive how little is actually here, other than a ton of these gross eel enemies, a smattering of finger creepers, some rare crafting ingredients, and most importantly of all, and the only real reason to visit these ruins, the finger bells, which must be ranked to progress through Count Emir's questline. For as barren as they are though, what can I say? I like them, or rather, I appreciate them. When I saw these huge, bizarre looking zones on the map for the first time, I was extremely curious to find out what on earth I was even looking at, as well as how to get there, and when I did finally get close enough for an overhead view, I fell out my chair. I'm exaggerating, I didn't actually fall out my chair, but I was blown away by the alien visuals and the sheer sizes of these places, just how totally unlike they were to anything else in Elden Ring. Actually getting through them and onto the bells is something of a gauntlet too, because there are a lot of eels, especially at the Finger Ruins of Dale, where you can even find some sleeping. They cast these super long range pink homing projectiles which paralyse you for long enough for one of them to teleport to your location for the big suck, and I hate it. The brain suckers from Bloodborne ain't got nothing on these guys. I guess you're supposed to use the uneven terrain to your advantage here to block the projectiles, but hey, I guess I'm just not good at the game, because I'd usually end up getting sucked anyway, regardless of my evasion strategy. Regardless of my evasion strategy. Evasion? I'll see myself out.
It was a funny joke. A lot of guys in here were like, that was good.
I've never heard.
Are the Finger Ruins a ton of fun? No. But that doesn't mean they're not cool, at least in a first playthrough. I really did explore near every inch of the fingers on my first visits. I guess because I was still in that new FromSoft content exhilaration frame of mind where I had to see and understand everything, and reading every item description, and fighting every eel and grabbing handfuls of nail stones which I will never use. This was just on playthrough 1 though, because I now always make a beeline straight to the finger bells and then warp the hell out of here, because there's really no reason to stick around after the initial wonder has worn off. Final location I want to talk about before we get onto the actual levels is the Ancient Ruins of Rau, because this is an example of a location that I also find to be really visually impressive, except I don't really like playing through it. Like most of the DLC's regions, it is stunning to behold, truly a vision. The very first time I made it here after crossing the long bridge of Shadow Keep, and this music started playing, and there's the shadow obscured form of Enir Ilum flickering in the sky, and there are these ancient structures and waterfalls and platforms in the sunlit distance. Well, I hit the site of grace and I got the hell out of there, not because I was disgusted by what I was seeing, but because I wanted to save it, to go and explore the rest of the map first, and then experience this magnificence. When I did eventually return though, just didn't quite live up to my expectations. The outdoor sections are very nice, featuring lots of gorgeous views of the rest of the map, impressive verticality, and some memorable encounters with fantastic enemies like the Horned Warriors. Not to mention the only Crucible Knight in the DLC, that being Devonia with her helmet that looks exactly like the Sulphur God from Fear and Hunger 2. The thing about the ancient ruins of Routh though is that half of it is indoors, and those sections are like this. Lots and lots of this. It's a damn grid-based labyrinth of corridors, doors and elevators, populated by a hell of a lot of Hornsent, with the occasional Curseblade and Manfly. I do like the idea of a region which has you navigating in and out of structures so as to make it through to the end. But in practice, here anyway, I do not much care for it, and this isn't a level I've looked forward to returning to on repeat playthroughs. I tend to just want to get to the rather excellent boss fight against Rellana as expediently as possible. I dislike these labyrinthine sections in the same way that I dislike the demon ruins from Dark Souls 3. It all looks the bloody same, and I've already seen all the enemies here in other places. Don't really have all that much more to say about the open world really. The way the regions are connected does make it feel more complex, but not always in a way that I like or that feels satisfying or intuitive to travel through. I have brilliant memories of spending hours exploring the expanses of Limgrave and Caelid and Liurnia, but even though I enjoy them well enough, I can't quite say the same about Gravesite Plain or Shadow Altus. The Realm of Shadow just doesn't quite feel like home to me, if that makes sense. Places like the Stone Coffin Fissure and Jagged Peak did offer memorable experiences with awesome visuals and lots of great moments, but nothing in the DLC really feels like a true evolution from the exploration found in the base game, but rather variations on what was already there, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Nothing here is bad. It's still an enjoyable and certainly dramatic open world experience, but I did feel a trifle underwhelmed at times. I think a new traversal mechanic or two would have gone a really long way. Some new way of getting around on Torrent, even if, like the blessing system, you could only use it in the Realm of Shadow. The terrain of the world could even have been uniquely shaped so as to make use of this. Even something as simple and generic as an air dash, or let us f***ing fly or glide or something, like Spyro the Dragon, I don't know. Don't get me wrong, I still did use Torrent a lot during my time with the DLC, but not in any new or interesting ways, which is a shame, and we still didn't get the damn option of dressing him up. Every time I fight Loretta, Knight of the Erdtree, I gaze the green gaze of envy at the extravagant armour worn by her horse, same with when I fight the draconic tree sentinel of the Knight's Cavalry. I know there was that whole horse armour debacle in Elder Scrolls Oblivion all those years ago, but I unironically do want horse armour in this game. Horse armour, my kingdom for some horse armour. One final aspect of the Realm of Shadow's open world that I should address before moving on is the Shadow Tree, and how strangely underused it is, at least in any direct sense. In the lands between, the Erdtree's incandescent form acts as something of a beacon, drawing you in from afar, and even becoming your official objective after collecting a couple of great runes, and then again at the end after it is set aflame. The Erdtree is massively important to the lands between, and even the region in which it is based is golden in colour to reflect its close proximity to the tree's golden rays. Furthermore, Altus Plateau is significantly higher than most of the rest of the lands between, elevated in both a physical and cultural sense. That's why, for example, Godric wishes to return to it, to ascend to the land of gold. The Shadow Tree is a bit different though, at least as far as it directly pertains to the DLC story of Miquella, Marika and Messmer, because you never have to journey to it, or even interact with it in any way, and as far as I know, it's only even referenced by any of the characters a single time, by the Hornsent, who refers to it as the misshapen Tree of Umbra. The tree is in very close proximity with Shadowkeep, it being the only way to navigate to its incredible looking base, thick with golden sap tinged with black. This can also be used to describe the ranged attacks used by the Erdtree avatar boss, which you yourself can learn by trading in its remembrance. Golden beams tinged with shadow, unlike the golden land Ash of War where the projectiles are pure gold. I said that the Erdtree is underused, but I don't mean that in a negative way, and this is mainly in comparison to its Erdtree equivalent. Rather than it being such an integral part of the world and story, it's just kind of there, more as a dark and unknowable arboreal phantom than a grand golden monolith of intense worship. The Erdtree literally is the shadow of the Erdtree, but it's not clear exactly what that means. Although it might not immediately be noticeable from a distance, it's actually composed of two trunks twisting around each other. You can get a brilliant view of this from the hinterlands. Furthermore, if you look at the top of the Erdtree, you can make out what seems to be the very top of the Erdtree, with its spectral golden branches clearly spreading out from the midst of the Erdtree's black ones. It's a very curious aspect which brings up questions regarding its nature and the meaning of its genesis, and of the Erdtree's position in the world relative to the Erdtrees. Are we in the middle of the lands between, except invisible? Are we above the lands between? Below? Am I thinking about it the wrong way entirely? Probably. The Erdtree is dark, mysterious and handsome, and for me it massively elevated the intrigue of the DLC story, and the puzzling snippets of information we get about its nature serve to make it all the more intriguing. As the remembrance of the Erdtree avatar states, the Erdtree is the shadow of the Erdtree, born of dark notions that bear no sense of order, that twist and bend its stalk, rendering it brittle. What does this mean? I don't know, but I do like it. Let's talk about some actual levels and stuff now, starting with the minor dungeons. Although they themselves aren't part of the open world, they're still relevant to the discussion, often being the rewards for exploration, some murky catacomb or smoky forge at the end of a valley, or up some grassy enemy-ridden path. There are even a couple of new types of minor dungeons here too, which is pretty cool. Hey, pretty neat. The first one I tried was one of these new ones, the Ruined Forge Lava Intake to be specific, and I was damn impressed. I honestly thought this might have been a legacy dungeon at first, though upon reaching the burning altar at the end and getting an ancient dragon smithing stone and a new weapon as a reward, realised it was a minor one. There are 3 forge dungeons in total, and they effectively replace the mines found in the lands between. You'll find a ton of smithing stones here, though the upgrade material aspect of the DLC is a wee bit strange. In fact, let's squeeze in a quick discussion about that here before I continue talking about the dungeons. Like I said, instead of simply allowing the player to further upgrade weapons or spirit ashes with higher level upgrade materials, we got Erdtree fragments and revered spirit ash. Fine. But because there are no higher level upgrade materials, the game will be giving you a whole lot of materials you'll either already have a ton of, or have easy access to via the Bell Maidens at Round Table Hold, if you've found the associated bell bearings, which you really should have by the time you take on the DLC, because even though you can get here far earlier than the endgame, it's still endgame level content. This isn't solely an issue with the forges either, it happens pretty much everywhere, including out in the open world. It became nearly comical when I'd be out exploring some level and see some shiny goodie in the distance and eagerly run to pick it up and get a Grave Glove Ward 3 for my troubles, or a Somber Smithing Stone 6 or 10 arrows. I mean, I guess you still do need this stuff when you want to try out some new DLC weapon, but it does get quite deflating to keep coming across stuff that you either don't need or won't use. Still, fair is fair, let's not pretend the base game wasn't just as guilty of this. Half the time when you picked something up there, it'd be some crafting material that you'd probably never use anyway, because crafting, although potentially very useful, is not and has never been remotely necessary for success in Elden Ring. The worst was when it'd be a purple pickup and you'd be expecting a swanky new talisman or shield or god knows what, and then it's just 3 gravel stones or something, or 1 arteria leaf. While we're on the subject, I feel much the same about the new consumable runes. In the base game we had golden runes from 1 to 13, then a few higher level variants after that, whilst in the DLC we have Shadow Realm runes from 1 to 7, which you'd think would give you boatloads more runes to match the increased threat of this new world, except they don't. Even a Shadow Rune 7 only gives you 30,000 runes, which just isn't that much at this point, especially considering that higher level Shadow Rune pickups are often situated in levels as if there's some great reward. Even the ultra rare rune of an unsung hero, of which I think there are only 2 in the DLC, give you just 50,000, which is the equivalent of what a base game Lord's rune gets you, except there are like 5 or 6 of those, not 2. Even Marika's rune disappoints just a bit. You would expect it to give you a square 100k at least, but nope, 80k. Why? The icon for Marika's rune is awesome though, gotta say. Its golden colour is extremely intense, and it features Marika's seal upon it, the same shape formed by her crucified body within the Erdtree. Don't want to bitch and moan excessively about the whole rune and upgrade material thing. Didn't bother me that much, didn't make me mad or anything, but there is a bit of a potency problem here, something of a disconnect between the effort required to find some items and their actual practical value. Anyway, now that I've ranted about that, back to minor dungeons. The forges are perfectly decent the first time round, occasionally even featuring environmental puzzles and interesting navigational hijinks. Never gets all that technical or anything, but these are more than just generic runs through an enemy-ridden cave or an imp-ridden tomb. Not a big fan of the actual golem enemies though. Also not sure why the devs feel the need to include a warning message on the ground recommending that you hit them where they're weakest. I think I could have worked that one out for myself, FromSoft. I'm not the type of player who enjoys just sprinting past enemies instead of engaging all of them, but after I toppled 2 or 3 of these golems, I was like, yeah, I get the picture, I don't need to keep fighting these guys. And the magma slime things are also pretty lame, they're just a fiery reskin of Silver Tears. Boo. The other new type of minor dungeon are the jails, of which there are also 3. You might remember the Bonnie jail being what some big name streamers got to try out in the DLC preview back in June. Although the forges are somewhat analogous to mines, even if they do look and play very different, the jails are far more their own thing, having significant importance to the story of the Hornsent and their fractious relationship with Queen Marika and her people, though I'll discuss that in more detail in the bosses section of the video. For now, let's just say that there's a heavy pot theme going on. Sure, the base game features plenty of pots too, hostile ones and some rather lovable ones, but the pot-based practices of the Realm of Shadow are far more disturbing than anything found in the lands between. And while some of the pots found in these jails are much the same as those we're already well familiar with, there are others. There tend to be lots of Hornsent in these dungeons too, who don't really make for super interesting enemies, but the presence of these shambling horrors makes the long descents down these cavernous jails distinctly unsettling and upsetting. These levels can get a fair bit technical too, with different routes through them, different holes to drop through, pot elevators, and ladders and even keys and stuff. And while all 3 jails still do have that minor dungeon feel to them, they're pretty damn good. I was most impressed with the Bayle jail. Goes on for surprisingly long and has some brilliant moments, like this one where you have to platform down from pot to pot, except the pot at the bottom is an actual enemy rather than a platform, and the sheer wackiness of this moment happening within this wretched, rancid dungeon was delightful. Not a major fan of any of the 3 bosses found within the jails though, gotta say. Curseblade Labyrinth is mostly the same as a regular Curseblade, except the arena is much darker, and it's barely got any HP as well for a boss. It's like a low tier Chalice dungeon boss from Bloodborne. The Lamenter is an NPC enemy, though it wears a special mask which allows it to disappear and multiply and stuff. It's fine, I guess, I don't know, it just never made much of an impression on me. Demi-human Swordmaster Onze is a much more remarkable foe, being way more swift and dexterous than any other demi-human in the game, and with a totally unique moveset, but I find him to be really annoying to fight. He's very fast and small and can teleport around, making it difficult to land hits. It can get frustrating as hell if he starts dominating you and then dashing off before you can return the favour. I think I'm something of an outlier when it comes to my opinion on Onze, because from what I've seen, most other people seem to like him, though I think the whole Yoda thing he has going on is a big part of the attraction. As a person who has absolutely zero interest in Star Wars though, f this little shit, and his degenerate antics. The DLC has a couple of caves and a few catacombs too, but I'm not going to go into too much detail on them. They're pretty much what you would expect, though I admit I did enjoy the catacombs more than I thought I would. There's more of an emphasis on traps now, including a couple of brand new though strangely underpowered ones, and I like just how far you descend down in these dungeons. You think you're at the bottom already, but no, here's another long elevator down, and then another. Was initially dismayed to see the return of the imp, but you know what? I'll allow it in this case because at least they are new enemy types with different designs and attacks, and they're totally exclusive to the catacombs. I really would have been perfectly fine with there being no catacombs at all for the DLC. In fact, that's what I did think until I eventually came to Darklight Catacombs, which you have to pass through in order to reach Abyssal Woods, before later coming across the other two as well. On the plus side, the Death Knight bosses at the bottom of the Scorpion River and Fog Rift dungeons do make for really great fights, and it was cool to see the Prince of Death's giant weird fish face again too, I guess. Let's finally get on to the juicy stuff though, the meat of the matter, the Legacy dungeons. I'd say the DLC has about 5 Legacy dungeons, those being Bayle Tower Settlement, Castle Ensis, Shadow Keep, Midris Manse and Enir Illim, though I guess you could classify Stone Coffin Fisher as one too, because you can't ride around on Torrent there, and it does end in a major boss, a damn good major boss too if you don't mind me saying. Interestingly, you only actually need to go to 2 of these dungeons to beat the game, those being Shadow Keep and Enir Illim. I used to think Castle Ensis was also mandatory, it being the nexus connecting Gravesite Plain to Shadow Altus, but no. There's actually a couple of spirit springs you can take located near the Elder's Hovel in Gravesite Plain's lower levels that will lift you to Shadow Altus, which, although I don't use it myself because I liked fighting Rellana, is a cool feature of the world. It's just like when you realise there's that tucked away cliffside path connecting Limgrave to Liurnia, and then from Liurnia you can get to Altus Plateau without fighting a single major boss. Bayle is a level that I'm surprised isn't mandatory, to the extent that it was only on my 3rd playthrough as I was getting repeatedly electrified, frozen and blown the fuck away by the bloody crouching tiger hidden dragon that I realised, hold on, I don't actually need to be here at all, do I? It's kind of odd really because although this is a really important level, it being the last remaining bastion of these shadowed Hornsent and a place of deep cultural and religious significance to them, filled with striking spiral symbolism and the shadow obscured form of Enir Illim floating silently above it, well, despite all that you can just not come here ever. All that happens at the end after beating the Dancing Lion is you have to turn back, because the entrance to Enir Illim is sealed by shadow thorns. Now, later on, after burning the sealing tree at the end of the ancient ruins of Rau to reveal the form of Enir Illim, and after activating the elevator in that latter level, you can travel directly between both it and Bayle. You actually have to do this if you want the most absurdly tucked away weapon that FromSoft have ever made, that being Euphoria. Awesome weapon by the way. This connection is totally optional though, you never actually need to take it. In fact, I did not even know you could travel directly between the 2 levels at first. It was only after I saw a video of somebody using the Euphoria weapon that I asked, where the hell do you get that? And then I looked it up. And after many minutes of unlikely jumping to and from platforms, ledges and stairways, I received my prize in a new pointless shortcut. When you do go to Enir Illim much later, you're just warped there in the same manner as how you get to Faram Azula, except in that case it made sense because Faram Azula was completely disconnected from the lands between, both spatially and temporally, whereas Enir Illim is right there above Bayle with a pre-existing entry point. All that aside though, Bayle is my favourite legacy dungeon in the DLC. I know, Shadow Keep, yeah. I'll get to my thoughts on that level in due time, you hear? I'm a sucker for an emotional ambience, a powerful aesthetic, a mournful soundtrack, and a well-structured level with enjoyable enemies. Now, got to say, I'm not actually the biggest fan of the Hornsent as enemies, because they're just not all that interesting to me, and there are too damn many of them in this world, they are everywhere. Even so, I do enjoy the way enemies are laid out within this level. The chunkier Hornsent in particular are great, and surprisingly challenging with their range and tricky delayed attack timings. And then you've got the smaller ones throwing out spiral incantations, with groups of enemies often being placed so as to demand serious attention and coordination from the player, where you're having to dodge AoE attacks and melee ones whilst gradually picking everyone off, and I think it works brilliantly here. It's not always about how interesting particular enemies are, but more what is done with them, how they are arranged with respect to their offensive capabilities and synergies. Speaking of interesting enemies though, Bayle is likely to be the first place you encounter a horned warrior, and man, that first time I was climbing up these steps and I saw one slowly walking past with its twin horned swords, I knew it was on, and indeed, it was on. This is another DLC enemy that likes to throw out endless and overwhelming combos, though their movements are that bit more understandable than those of the aforementioned Curse Blades. This shit gets amplified later in Enir Ilum too, with that level throwing the Golden Divine Bird Warriors at you and Divine Beast Horned Warriors, each of whom make use of an element used by the Divine Beast Dancing Lion. Those ones are kind of a goddamn nightmare actually, but even so, they are sick. Bayle might not be the first legacy dungeon you come to if you choose to cross the Elak Great Bridge towards Castle Ensis from the 3-point path site of Grace, instead of heading westward, but it definitely set a high bar for me. It's got a real melancholy magic to it, and is intelligently challenging with its enemy choices and enemy placements, though admittedly I could take or leave the Well Depths section with its overabundance of manflies, not to mention a poison tree spirit. Like I said, Castle Ensis lies the other way. It was there I myself first headed on my first playthrough, ploughing headlong across the well-guarded bridge and through the even weller-guarded camp before infiltrating into the castle. I'd already seen a few Messmer soldiers before this, specifically near the Church of Consolidation, but they are present in far greater number at Castle Ensis. There's a strong carrion aspect to the place as well, it being where Rellana, sister to Rennala and staunch ally of Messmer, resides. Gotta say, wasn't terribly impressed when I first saw the carrion troll, nor the crown-wearing sorcerer, and certainly nor these annoying disappearing sorcerer nobles, and nor was I all that impressed with Castle Ensis in general. It's a step above the likes of Castle Redmane, Morn and Sol from the base game, but not by all that much, and while the addition of sorceress elements might have made it more appealing for some, I found them to be a bit tired. I mean, we've seen all this stuff before, but way better. As I'll get into shortly in the enemy variety section of the video, I am a big fan of the Messmer soldiers, and an even bigger fan of Black Knights, and their presence certainly does do a lot to make Castle Ensis runs decently enjoyable, even if the themes and designs of the level fail to dazzle me. Speaking of enemies though, whereas in Rea Lucaria we had that parrying prick Moongrum, here we have, presumably his brother, Moonrithil, and he's way worse. There are some NPC encounters where you can just get in there and have a jolly old exchange of blows and hopefully come out on top, but for Moonrithil you have to play so bloody cautiously. He hits outrageously hard with his greatsword. Also, unless you take the time to clear out the nearby group of sorcerer nobles on every attempt, they will periodically pelt you with magic as you're just trying to fight him, making the whole affair that much more annoying. Honestly, excluding the boss fights, this was the spot in the DLC where I died the most. How about a montage?
find them. Was that last year?
Okay, so that's what Helen thinks.
Okay, yeah, I'll go with that. Fantastic beasts and where to find them.
So, to keep you in the game, is fantastic beasts and where to find them a terrible answer?
Castle Ensis really isn't a bad level at all. I just think it's a wee bit uninspired, being only a bit better than the base game's weaker castles, and nowhere near as good as the mighty Stormveil castle, which remains an S tier level. Let's go somewhere completely different now, into Midra's Manse, the level situated in the furthest reaches of the deepest location in the game, the Abyssal Woods. Although conditions outside the manse are thoroughly foggy, largely barren and tainted by the distinctive yellow of the frenzied flame, things are far brighter within, featuring artwork, books, and even a butler to welcome us in. Yes, Midra's Manse is absolutely cooked, a ruined wreck of a place, not only as a result of the presence of the frenzied flame, but also from the Hornsent Inquisitors, both thin and fat, who inhabit the place still. Interesting level in that way, because while most places in the realm of Shadow are characterised by the oppression of the Hornsent at the hands of Messmer, here it's Hornsent attacking their own, with Midra, his people and his home having been destroyed by the Inquisitors. One subtle detail here is that Midra, as seen in this large portrait, does not possess any horns, in comparison to the Inquisitors, who sport the most extravagant horns of any Hornsent we see, appearing nearly akin to antlers, or the Crucible tree helm. This might be a partial contributor to their slaughter of the Manse's inhabitants, though the biggest reason of all is of course Midra's association with the Flame of Frenzy, and as you travel through the level, his frenzied screechings and warnings to stay away echo through the halls of this ruined home. Makes this rather a tense level to play through the first time, because you know there's going to be something spicy at the end, and indeed there is. Midra is an absolutely brilliant boss. Boss aside though, this isn't a terribly ambitious level. You get a very good idea of what the whole level is the second you enter. Lots of scorched books and corridors and ruined tables and stuff. And like many places in this DLC, it's filled with Hornsent, and there's a bunch of rats too. Not even a new kind either, because we already had frenzied rats in the base game. The Inquisitors are more enjoyable to fight, with them being found further into the manse closer to Midra's chamber, but you also have seen a bunch of them beforehand throughout the Abyssal Woods, and in the boss fight with Jore, which kicks it all off. And they're not even unique to this general area either, they also appear in Enir Ilum. This is an okay level, but it's not great. Midra as a boss really is good enough to warrant a visit to the Abyssal Woods, but were it not for him, I'd be far more likely to skip this place entirely, because Midra's Manse by comparison isn't enjoyable enough to warrant the long and perilous trek to get to it. Okay then, Shadow Keep. Oof. I'm not actually too sure what people think about this level, because there's still many aspects of the DLC that I haven't sought out discussions for, and I've purposely avoided other video essays on it too, because I don't want my own opinions to be influenced by others. Not that I jump on any bandwagons or anything, but it can happen unconsciously, where somebody makes a point and you go, oh yeah, that's a pretty good point, and just like that you've acquired a new opinion and you didn't even mean it. Back to Shadowkeep though. I can easily see this being a lot of people's new favourite Elden Ring level, because it's big, it's varied, it's hard, it's complex, and it's got a disproportionately high concentration of major bosses. You've got Messmer directly within, and then Gaius and the Shadow Tree avatar at very close proximity to it, not to mention the golden hippopotamus at the very start. There's a hell of a lot going on here, and it's directly connected to many other places. Shadow Altus to the south and the east, Shadow View to the north, Shadow Tree Base also to the north, the Hinterlands to the northeast, which also leads onto the Finger Ruins of Dale, the ancient ruins of Rau to the west, and the keep leads onto the lower levels of Shadow Altus, which then leads onto Darklight Catacombs, which is the only way to reach the Abyssal Woods. That is a wild level of interconnectivity right there. Shadowkeep is a major nexus point of the map, and an imposing and impressive sight from far off with the way its namesake shadows hover in the air. I mentioned that it's varied too, and you bet it is. In fact, it's essentially 3 levels in one. You've got the sort of castle fort type section which contains a whole lot of Messmer soldiers and Black Knights. The church district which starts off flooded but which can be drained so as to allow you to explore the lower levels. Hope you like crabs and tree spirits. And most significantly of all, the Specimen Storehouse, which is itself connected to the other sections of Shadowkeep via elevators and shortcuts. The Specimen Storehouse clearly is intended to be the belle of the ball here. In fact, it might just be the single most complicated level FromSoft have ever made. Take the research hall from Bloodborne, make it bigger and more confusing, replace the bloated head patients with shadowed Hornsent and Fire Knights, and you've got the Specimen Storehouse. Here's the thing though. In the immortal words of Shania Twain, that don't impress me much. I like the more traditional fort type parts of Shadowkeep quite a bit. And the church district is fine, even if it is a bit watery and miserable. But the storehouse is a pain in the arse for me to get around in. So many elevators and ladders and stairways and ledges and f***ing enemies. These Hornsent scholars are everywhere and they will pelt you with Messmer fire projectiles as you make your way through, including when some bastard of a Fire Knight is going at you with a never-ending combo, and so much of your journey through this level is characterised by the non-stop killing of weak and rather uninteresting but annoying enemies. I spoke earlier about how the verticality of the DLC's open world negatively affected my ability to enjoy it, and I feel the same here, but even more so. I mean, there are 5 different sites of grace in the Specimen Storehouse alone, 7 if you include the 2 at Messmer's Arena, and that doesn't even include the rest of Shadowkeep. Now the way I'm ranting and raving here might make it sound like I hate Shadowkeep, but I don't. I still do appreciate its complexity and ambition, even if I can't fully enjoy it. It's just that, for me, it's too much. Too many shortcuts and unintuitive connections. It gives me a damn headache trying to navigate my way through it, even if it does look very impressive. I compared the storehouse to Bloodborne's research hall, but the difference is that I love the research hall. In fact, in my big Soulsborne level ranking video from back in December, I put it at number 4, whereas I wouldn't even place Shadowkeep in the top 30. By the way, I've got to include this unedited footage of me trying to fast travel to the Shadowkeep main gate site of grace, only for the game to instead trigger the cutscene for me activating the mechanism to drain the water in the church district. Why did it do that? It's extra bizarre because I'd already drained the water way earlier in this same playthrough, and also the wall texture's all glitchy here. Scary stuff. And last but certainly not least, Enir Ilum, the final level. Already touched on it before when discussing Belrat because indeed the two are connected, but like I said, the first time you get to Belrat, Enir Ilum will be completely inaccessible, its holy form obscured through the power of the sealing tree located in the ancient ruins of Rau. The cutscene of it appearing is absolutely beautiful too. I love the way it initially appears nearly spectral and golden, echoing the colour and character of the Erdtree before coming fully into form, kicking off the final ascent to the gates of divinity at the very top of this ancient spiral structure, this enigmatic tower to the heavens. Shadowkeep might be visually impressive both from the outside and the inside, but Enir Ilum is breathtaking. Even the name, Enir Ilum. Don't know what it means, but it fits perfectly. The entire level has a heavy spiral theme. Spirals were very common in Belrat, we even had enemies using spiral incantations on you, but this level literally is a complex spiral, and one built, at least to some degree, out of human remains. You might not even notice it at first with how majestic it all looks, but many columns have outcroppings of corpses, and it's a marvellously morbid aesthetic touch. FromSoft are the kings of juxtaposing beauty with horror, and levels like this very much exemplify that. There's quite a good mix of enemies in Enir Ilum, but sadly not quite as much new stuff as I think there should have been. You'll already have seen Inquisitors, Manflies, Curseblades and Gravebirds in several other places, though that's not to say that it's a pushover to battle through them all, and it's certainly no easy feat to overcome any of Ilum's Divine Guardians. You get hit with a Divine Bird Warrior very early on who, whilst looking amazing, are pretty much the same as Horned Warriors, with just 1 or 2 extra attacks, but there are a further 3 Horned Warriors who wear Divine Beast masks upon their heads, and these guys are absolutely brutal, especially the Ice one. In fact, you know what? F the Ice one. I still don't quite understand what the intended strategy is here, other than to try and kill it before it gets a chance to get going, because these AoE ice attacks are nonsense, and worst of all, it respawns. The Wind one at the end is also extremely tough, and made worse by how hazardous the journey to it is, through all those Gravebirds with their spectral rings of light attack. The Sights of Grace do feel a wee bit more punishing here, compared to most other Elden Ring levels. Aenir Ilum is a damn fine major dungeon, and a bloody beautiful one too. Between the nearby Belrat and this, I do prefer the former because of its more grounded structure allows for more enjoyable exploration, whereas Aenir Ilum is more of a final arduous ascent than an exercise in exploration, but that's what makes it such an effective precursor to the final encounter at the Gates of Divinity. Assessing the Legacy dungeons as a whole, they are good. Castle Ensis and Midra's Manse fell a wee bit short for me, with the latter level in particular being outclassed even by a couple of the jail levels in my opinion, but they're certainly not unenjoyable, and calling them low effort would also be unfair and untrue, so I won't call them that. I'll just call them shit. They're not really shit, I'm just joking. At the other end, Shadow Keep was just too damn much for this humble Scotsman to handle, a bit too ambitious for its own good, too many confounding complexities concentrated in the one cursed location. The level tends to leave me more frazzled than fulfilled, though I do still think that it's important to give it its due for its scale and technicality. The star of the show for me is Belrat Tower Settlement, and by extension Aenir Ilum. These levels are by far the most narratively dense of the DLC in my eyes, with the most unique and interesting structures and aesthetics, and although they might lack some of the complexity of Shadow Keep and several base game Legacy dungeons, I rate them both very highly indeed. I'd really like to get talking about enemies and enemy variety soon, but before that, got to spare some time for the NPCs. When we meet Needle Knight Leda by the Cocoon, she immediately assumes us to have been guided there by kindly Miquella, and while that's actually not the case for us, it is true of nearly all the NPCs encountered within the Realm of Shadow, namely Redmane Freya, Dryleaf Dane, Tollier, my man Sir Ansbach, and Sir Moor, all of whom are devoted followers of the absent Empyrean. There's also the Hornsent, but unlike the others, he's not from the Lands Between, but rather has witnessed firsthand the atrocities carried out by Messmer and his army here in his homeland, to the extent that, also unlike the others, he regards us with immediate hostility, seeing us as an agent of the Erdtree, just another invader from the Lands Between, though his false assumption that you share a devotion to Miquella stops him from taking this hostility to any immediate extremes. You can encounter nearly all of them very soon after entering the Realm of Shadow. You won't see Leda again until you reach Shadow Altus, but Freya and the Hornsent are at the 3-point path Site of Grace in Gravesite Plain, while Sir Ansbach and Sir Moor are situated right outside Belrat. Tollier is the most awkward one to find, with his ass being parked on a cliff overlooking Jagged Peak. Didn't find Tollier myself at all on my first playthrough at all, to tell you the truth. Only came across the soft-spoken simp on my second playthrough. I had my troubles with Sir Moor too, not with finding the armoured knight, but with the fact that he attacked me and I killed him. At a few spots out in the wilderness, you'll come across what are known as foragers, kindred of rot essentially, except instead of them being hostile like all the others are, they're friendly and busy digging through the grass. They'll even gift you with cookbooks. The annoying aspect of this is that we've been hardwired into wanting to squash these bugs as soon as we see them, and so it's easy as hell to kill one and only realise afterwards that actually I shouldn't have done that. Damn it. On my first playthrough, I did this to the one in Shadow Altus, causing Sir Moor to invade me, and just like that, his story was over for me. Damn it. He's pretty damn tough too, though the verdigris set that he drops is one of the heaviest and most protective in the game. I think it's just the bull goat set that has it beat. Did experience more of Sir Moore's content on my other playthroughs though, which even crosses over into Tolly's when he requests you take some black syrup to the sleepy simp. Got to be honest, and I'm not going to mince my words here, I don't give a f*** about Sir Moore. This character did absolutely nothing for me. Didn't really like his voice acting all that much, and didn't find him very interesting or lovable, as I guess he's supposed to be. This isn't the first time I've strayed from the intended path of affection either. Remember Gavlan from Dark Souls 2? Well, I think he sucks and I don't like him.
With Gavlan, you will, you deal.
Hey Gavlan, shut up. Tollier, on the other hand, I've got a lot more time for. Loved his voice acting and how nervous and unconfident he sounds anytime you engage with him, and although you don't need to interact with him at all to get into Stonecoffin Fissure and meet St. Trina, the way his quest intersects with it is fantastic. His emotional and jealous attachment to the scent of sleep is really well done, the way he gets all pissy when he realises that she's spoken to us but not to him, even going so far as to invade us in anger. A brilliant and surprising aspect of his story is that even if you beat him in the invasion, he's still alive and his questline isn't even over. Instead, he pulls himself up by his bootstraps and actually turns out to be a bit of a badass when he later fights alongside you in Enir Ilum. Hell yeah, dude. The only thing I'm not so hot on with the whole Trina thing is that you need to drink her nectar and end yourself 4 bloody times before she starts communicating with you. For me though, after the second time I drank it and died, I just left, assuming that there must be nothing else to do here at this point. I had the exact same problem in Ranni's questline too, where you need to keep selecting the talk to doll option after picking it up. I tried to talk to it twice, nothing happened, and so I just stopped talking to it, except what you're supposed to do is just keep doing the thing that caused nothing to happen before. For the Ranni questline, I think they added in a wee dot icon in a later update to make it clearer that you need to keep talking to the doll, but that wasn't there at launch. Anyway. Now on to Red Main Freya. I don't like her very much also. For a start, not sold on the voice acting at all. I think it's markedly worse than most other voice acting in Elden Ring, and in a game featuring such stellar performances, it's really noticeable.
I'm afraid I'm busy. Truly. I should have asked Ansbach to impart his knowledge when I had the chance. From Sir Ansbach? To me? What on earth could it... Oh. Yes. Of course. I see.
As far as her questline, meh, blech, blech. She sticks around in Gravesite Plain for a while and then migrates off to Shadow Keep to rummage through some old scrolls until you find a secret scroll that only Sir Ansbach can translate, and so he does this and explains the content to you before giving you a letter to give to Freya, and then you do give it to her and then she f***s off until the big battle later on in Enir Ilum. Freya is important for bringing General Radahn back into the player's mind though, with him of course being her former leader. She even wields a very similar sword to the fallen demigod, though one lacking any sort of magical enchantment. I personally wasn't thinking of Radahn at all coming into the DLC, but when she spoke of some vow made between he and Miquella, I was very intrigued, and indeed, Radahn turns out to be a very important part of the DLC indeed. Ah, Sir Ansbach. Sir Ansbach is my man's back. Without a doubt my favourite NPC in the DLC. Now I've learned my ABCs. Please, oh God, please won't you play with me. Super cool character, brilliantly voice acted, and out of any other character, he is the one who most inflamed my curiosity towards the story. Curiosity regarding what Miquella was up to in the realm of Shadow. Ansbach was a pure-blood knight, fiercely loyal to the now dead, by our hand, Lord Mohg, who he speaks of in extraordinarily high regard, which is very interesting considering what a refined and intelligent character Ansbach clearly is, when compared to the rather awful way of things in Mohgwyn Palace. I mean, that place is basically hell. His manner is also an interesting contrast to the seemingly mad nature of Lord Moog. I mean, the item description for his rogue even implies that he's a raving lunatic. Everyone seems to have a ton of respect for Sir Ansbach, though compared to the rest of Miquella's coterie, he's noticeably more reserved in his expressions of adoration for the demigod, being more interested in what exactly Miquella is up to here. Although I love Sir Ansbach's dialogue, the actual structure of his questline isn't better than anything else. In fact, you ever think that FromSoft's NPC questlines might actually be shit? 90% of them just involve speaking to characters at specific locations until they move elsewhere, or until some often ambiguous other condition has been fulfilled. Then you speak to them at the next place, if you can manage to work out where that is with little to no guidance, and maybe at some point in the quest there'll be an item that needs to be found or a battle to be fought. But don't screw it up, or f*** you, everything's ruined now, and you don't get to try again until the next playthrough. Anyone remember that Siegmeyer bit in Lost Izalith? The only thing that makes FromSoft's NPC quests enjoyable is the quality of the writing, the voice acting, and how compelling the lore is. And so it's a damn good thing that all those elements are almost always so damn good. On a more complimentary note, I now want to discuss a very important and interesting aspect of the NPCs and their quests, and that is Miquella's Great Rune. The devotion that Miquella's followers feel towards him is heavily affected by the power of his rune. They are effectively all under his spell. The usage of terms of endearment like kindly Miquella, gentle Miquella, etc. are a result of this spell, this bewitchment. Everyone loves him, but in several cases that's because their hearts have been stolen and their true feelings nullified. Even so, from speaking to everyone, it's clear that their personalities are still very much present. They haven't been zombified, it's just that they are under a state of emotional compulsion. Needle Knight Leda is well aware of the charm placed upon everyone. She even comments on it while it's still active, even acknowledging that the group would almost certainly have came to blows without the Great Rune, but are able to find common cause because of it. Well, when you progress further through Shadow Altis, this happens. I absolutely love this moment. There's no cutscene or anything, no real halting of the action, just this strange event that almost seems like it occurs randomly. I had no idea what even triggered it on my first playthrough, because it happened out of nowhere just past Bonnie Village, and on my second playthrough it happened at a totally different spot as I was nearing Shadow Keep, but yeah, apparently it always happens at one of these two places. As the message says, a powerful charm has been broken, and indeed, the charm referred to is the one affecting our ragtag band of compatriots, irreversibly progressing their questlines, and in some cases even shifting their allegiances. Leda and the Hornsent are barely changed at all, with their devotion remaining as strong as it ever was, with the Hornsent still being motivated by a lust for vengeance, which he believes can only be obtained through Miquella against Messmer, Marika and the Erdtree. Leda, on the other hand, is by far the most loyal follower of Miquella, to the extent that she didn't even require the demigod's charm to sustain her worship, nor the light gold rune long ago given to her by him to bring a soft hue to her faded eyes. The only thing that changes in Leda is that she immediately becomes concerned that in the absence of the charm, certain of the others might now turn against her beloved demigod. You can even suggest characters for her to hunt down, though every time I did this I was duly rebuffed and just got some admittedly great extra dialogue. One character she does go after, however, is Sir Ansbach, who experiences the most drastic change of heart by far when the rune breaks, delivering some of my all-time favourite FromSoft dialogue.
Could not have been more mistaken. Miquella the Kind is a monster, pure and radiant. He wields love to shrive clean the hearts of men. There is nothing more terrifying. Righteous tarnished. Miquella the Kind makes my blood run cold. I am loath to admit it, But even at this very instant, I wish to run very far away indeed.
Fantastic story moment. The way there's so much glowing adoration for Miquella from everyone, and how you're picturing this pure childlike being journeying from cross-site to cross-site, sacrificing pieces of his being for some good and divine purpose. And then Sir Ansbach here is like, no, Miquella is a divine horror, a mass manipulator who will bend reality to his will, beguiling any naysayers to the point where they become his most staunch believers. This is exactly what happened with Ansbach himself, who went so far as to try and kill Miquella to release his Lord Mohg from his spell, only for him to be spellbound himself. It's a cold and frightening revelation that changed the way I thought about Miquella and made me very eager to learn more about him and ultimately meet him. You can assist Ansbach in his fight against Leda at Shadowkeep, though Leda can't actually be killed here as the true battle is later to come. But on my third playthrough I did the opposite and sided with Leda against Ansbach just to see what would happen, and although it was painful and wrong, I'd also recommend people do this at least once, because you get the retaliatory crossed tree talisman for doing it, which is extremely good. As much as I love the great rune breaking event, I don't love how it force progresses everyone's questline, because you've got no way of knowing about this on your first playthrough, and you are locked out of many interesting and enlightening interactions after it happens. There's actually an even worse example of this too, and that's the final fight with all your allies against Miquella's loyalists. Oh, don't get me wrong, the fight itself is brilliant. It's a dramatic and difficult battle against some very formidable characters who you may well have become attached to. The fight features brilliant accompanying dialogue as you're all duking it out and a killer soundtrack, and you can loot everyone's bodies afterwards for their weapons and armour, hehehe. As well as have a final conversation with Ansbach where he tells you that he knows it was you who killed Lord Mohg, but that he doesn't hold any grudges because it was an honourable duel between two powerful beings. Sir Ansbach's the man. Again, he is my man's back. That final NPC battle is indeed awesome, except here's what happened to me on my first playthrough. What had happened was, I hadn't finished anyone's questlines at all by the time I got to Empyrean. I'd seen Sir Ansbach and Freya in Shadowkeep, but just hadn't found the secret scroll, didn't even know it existed, and with Ansbach's quest not being progressed, this limited what I could do with Leda. Didn't even find Toye at all on my first playthrough, and because I was a dumbass who didn't realise that you're meant to use that gesture on Dryleaf Dane to initiate the duel with him, didn't get far with that either. Well, when I got to Empyrean, I foolishly progressed a bit too far, to the chamber where the big fight with everyone takes place, meaning that everything was now ruined. Everyone's questlines are just cancelled if you do this, because this is where you fight some and fight alongside others. This is the climax of all the NPC's stories. As a result of me unwittingly going too far in, I missed some super important story details about Radahn and Mohg, and Miquella's true intentions here in the realm of Shadow, and it rather annoyed me. Because what the hell did I know? It was my first playthrough. I don't like how easy it is to completely ruin a questline in a game where you cannot load earlier saves, especially considering how long playthroughs of Elden Ring can last, and now gotta wait till New Game Plus before I get to try again. Even now, after a few playthroughs of the DLC, there are still many interactions and bits of dialogue that I have neither seen nor heard, because I dislike having to follow a guide very closely in order to see them. But I guess that has always been the case for me with these games. Dark Souls 3 was especially bad for its awkward and easily messed up NPC quests. Grumbling aside though, I did enjoy the DLC's NPC experience. Didn't connect with every character, but Sir Ansbach is for sure one of the all-time greats, and Leda and Toye were excellent also. Not to mention Egon, who I haven't forgotten about, but whom I've not spoken about in this section due to how disconnected he is from all the Miquella business. Hey viewers, You know, one of the things I most look forward to about new FromSoft content? One of the elements that makes their weird and wonderful worlds so engaging to travel through and explore? The enemies, of course, and I'm pleased to report that many of the new additions are a damn treat, several of whom I've already brought up at some point. One new enemy that I mentioned a while ago when discussing Messmer is his Fire Knights, with all their fancy fireball foolishness. Although they'll frequently throw out those uniquely tricky projectiles, Fire Knights also have a plethora of sweeping slash combos at their disposal, emitting constant forward pressure, making mincemeat of your health bar, no matter how bloated it may be. Though having a nice colossal weapon can help cut through their bullshit by just bashing them in the head a few times, then finishing them off with a crispy critical. Now that's what I call flower power. The only place the Fire Knights are to be found is in Shadowkeep. As far as I know, they don't feature anywhere else. There are a lot of them here though, particularly in the Specimen Storehouse, where they make the complicated ascent up it a profoundly dangerous one. There's a rather impressive degree of variety with the Fire Knights. You'll find ones wielding short swords, twin swords and great swords, but then you've got the captain of the Fire Knights, standing guard outside the door to Messmer's chamber, wearing the winged serpent helm in tribute to his demigod master, and throwing out the flame spear attack, which he drops as an ash of war upon defeat. There's also Salza, who wields twin short swords and literally rains down fire upon you as you ride along the long bridge to the ancient ruins of Rau. And let's not forget Fire Knight Wago, wearing his signature double-faced death mask, summoning putrid corpses from the cathedral floor for chain reactions of chaotic conflagrations and fiery fulminations. And there's also the likes of this cock at the top of the Specimen Storehouse, who casts the Wrath from Afar incantation, designed to knock you asunder. As I explained earlier, I'm not the most avid enjoyer of Shadowkeep, with the chief reason being how convoluted and confusing the Specimen Storehouse is, but the Fire Knights can occasionally bring out far more acute ill feelings in me. I like the fireball stuff, but getting destroyed in seconds with one of the ridiculous dual blade combos, especially when you're doing well here, sucks. And there really are quite a lot of these enemies situated throughout the greater level. Funnily enough, my opinion of Fire Knights is quite similar to my opinion of Shadowkeep. I respect them and they are cool, but I don't necessarily enjoy fighting them. Fire Knights are the most formidable and skilled of Messmer's army, but it's not all about blazing extravagance, which brings me to his soldiers. Messmer's soldiers were not an enemy I was initially very excited about upon seeing them. I mean, when I think of my favourite enemies from these games, they tend not to be the literal rank and file. They tend to be ones with interesting designs, with a bit of size and girth to their forms, with some degree of pizzazz, perhaps coloured with some dreadful backstory to make them all the more intriguing. But judging enemies on those bases alone can be a bit shallow, and the same thing goes for bosses. I mean, look at Ceaseless Discharge. What an incredible looking being, but is the fight with him good? No. When it comes down to it, what matters is how fun things are to fight, how engaging the enemy's movesets are to contend with, and on that basis, my good fellow, I put it to you that Messmer's soldiers are a straight A tier enemy, not an S tier, not on the same tier as, say, the old hunters from Bloodborne or the dark wraiths from Dark Souls 1, but pretty bloody good nonetheless. Just like the Fire Knight's fireballs always get me in the face, Messmer soldiers catch me with their stomps, spear thrusts and ferocious axe combos. It's like the rhythm of their attacks is that bit offset from what I expect from an enemy of their size, and the placement of them is just fiendish in some levels. Like in this particular section of Shadowkeep where one is situated so that you get stomped over the edge as you progress up the steps past this opening. And Castle Ensis also had some ingenious setups where I actually had to pause and think about how to handle a section rather than just running in wildly. Not that they make for super difficult enemies when fought on their own, like a Fire Knight or Horned Warrior, but rather I just think they're very effective as a regular enemy that you're going to see a lot, and often in number, because they are actually intimidating rather than ever becoming easy or mindless to dispatch. But then we've got the Black Knights. Out of the way, dumbass, there's a new Black Knight in town. FromSoft ran out of names for enemies and now they're recycling old ones. Whilst Messmer soldiers absolutely look like the kinds of fighters who you would expect to be carrying out such a brutal crusade, what with their rather frightening face-shaped helms and ragged cloaks, the Black Knights of the Crusade are far grander in appearance, though still very robustly armed and armoured. There are many varieties of knights in the base game, ranging from the Cocoon Knights in Liurnia to the Erdtree Knights in Elfvale, all the way to the Knights Cavalry, and indeed, the Black Knights are yet another iteration of this enemy type, and arguably one of the best. You'll sometimes find them mounted, but they also appear on foot, wielding either a black steel great hammer or a black steel twin blade. You can even find spirit ashes to make use of warriors wielding each of these weapons, which, although mostly coloured black, feature decorative embellishments of gold, enabling additional holy damage. The ones who wield the Great Hammers even have a special guard counterattack which looks remarkably similar to the kinds of golden attacks thrown out by Radahn, though the twin blade variants are much more hectic and, in my opinion, not as enjoyable to deal with. Overall though, really sick enemy and just what the DLC needed. Yes, the Messmer soldiers are great, but got to have big imposing humanoid type enemies too. If I can throw out a random comparison, the Horned Warriors and Black Knights are, to this DLC, what the Millwood Knights and Ringed Knights are to Dark Souls 3. Classic FromSoft enemies with killer designs and formidable movesets. I briefly mentioned the Blood Fiends before as being one of the Realm of Shadow's more monstrous enemy types. They're pretty damn gross, looking like more bloated and barbaric omens, though they also remind me of Ollie the Alien, a hideous but lovable character from some crappy show they showed us back at school. My American watchers will not get that reference, but I know there's a small percentage of folk from the UK who definitely will. Give me a yee-haw down in the comments if you remember Ollie the Alien. Other than them looking somewhat similar, I don't think there is an actual connection between omens and blood fiends, the latter of which do not have horns. In actuality, these beings seem to be descended from demi-humans. The blood fiend Hexer's ashes state that long ago a subjugated tribe discovered a twisted deity amongst the ravages of war, and they were transformed into blood fiends. The Mother of Truth, who we know as the Formless Mother, was their saviour. I initially assumed the subjugated tribe referred to here would have been a human tribe, but a really cool detail is that blood fiends have a small chance to drop this string ingredient when killed, and who are the only other type of enemies in the game to drop string? It's demi-humans. Blood fiends aren't super common in terms of their distribution across the Realm of Shadow, though in the places you do find them, they tend to be concentrated in surprising number for enemies of such physical bulk and bloodlust. There are tons of these things in Prospect Town, Row Base and Rivermouth Cave, but there's also a contingent of them down in Stone Coffin Fissure who, instead of making use of blood incantations and bloodletting weapons like all the others, use moves tinged with Eternal Sleep, a new status effect introduced by the DLC, which is essentially a stronger version of regular sleep, kinda like how Scarlet Rot is a stronger version of poison. There are loads more enemies in the DLC, and while I'm not going to go through every single one, I do largely think they are of a high quality, sometimes mechanically, other times conceptually, and sometimes a wonderful combination of the two. I mean, the Shaman Flesh amalgamations aren't an especially demanding foe to fight, but they're not meant to be. They're meant to be viscerally upsetting and disturbing, which they certainly are, good god. Those weird blue spirit worm things are a pain in the ass to fight, but most of the time you're not really meant to fight them, hence why the majority are non-hostile. And what they lack in mechanical enjoyability, they make up for in their weirdness and strange spectral beauty and the many places where they gather in number across the land. And also they remind me of these pink things from this particular phase of the Ghost Train level from Cuphead. The Horned Warriors, Black Knights, Messmer Soldiers and these fat f***s in particular are highlights for me, and while I don't necessarily, really enjoy fighting the likes of Fire Knights and Curse Blades, I do appreciate the level of skill they demand from the player. It's only correct that such hard as balls enemies appears in the DLC of what is meant to be a very challenging game. However, got to say the enemy variety is an issue I have with the DLC, and it was something I noticed very early on. Enemy variety was considered by many to be an issue with the base game too, not because there was a paltry selection of enemies and enemy variants in it, but because the game world was really, really big. The regions were massive, the legacy dungeons were huge. There were more optional dungeons and landmarks that you can shake a stick at, and there were a whole lot of enemies and bosses roaming around to populate them, but not quite enough. It's like going into a cafe to have someone make you up a delicious sandwich, thick with mouth-watering meat, cheese and mayo, oh my god. But then the maker of sandwiches announces, actually no, I think we can go bigger. And so they transfer the same amount of ingredients to a foot-long sub instead of a regular sized sandwich. Are the ingredients delicious? Sure, but nah, this analogy is shit. It doesn't really work. Never mind, but do you get what I mean though? Guys, give me a yeehaw down in the comments if you get what I mean. The point is this. From around 60% of the way through the base game, it started to feel a bit disenchanting when you entered some new area and saw that you'd already seen most of the enemies there before in one form or another. And this was especially the case with the end game areas like Miquella's Erdtree, Vale on the mountaintops of the Giants. Classic example in that latter region is how it brought back the monstrous crows and dogs from Caelid. These two enemies are a big reason why Caelid is so terrifying on a first playthrough. These hideous, soulless fiends, perched on rotten ruins and feasting on corrupt carrion. I was genuinely afraid to fight them at all the first time I came here. I snuck past them like a bitch, and it's awesome. But then much later you get to the mountaintops of the Giants and here they are again, and while they're still a cool enemy, the wonder of the game's open world is dimmed just that little bit due to their reuse. They go from being special and unique to partially feeling more like models with movesets that are used to fill out this massive game. Imps are another example of gross overuse. I don't truthfully consider the common imp to really be a bad enemy, but I was already a bit sick of them after fighting so many thralls in Dark Souls 3, and then FromSoft went and jammed them in nearly every goddamn catacomb, often in irritating ways. Thank God they didn't bring imps back for the DLC. The repetition was particularly egregious with Elden Ring's bosses though. It became nearly comical how many times it had you fight Erdtree avatars and tree spirits. Thank God they didn't bring them back for the DLC. Well, even though the Realm of Shadow is not as big as the Lands Between, it's still bloody big, surprisingly so, and even though there are a decent number of new enemies, I found myself getting a bit tired of fighting some of them, and especially tired of seeing old base game enemies I was already very familiar with. Do we really need to be fighting hordes of rats again all the fucking time? There are so many crabs and dogs and rats and bats, and it's not that those are all bad enemies, but rather I just don't need to be fighting them again. By now they are boring to me because I'm all too familiar with their moves. There were honestly times when I found myself rolling my eyes, like when I got to Castle Ensis and saw a carrion troll and a sorcerer outside the entrance. It's like, oh, we're fighting these things again? We're doing this again? Oh look, the Vulgar Militia are back, except with a palette swap. Oh look, the Undead Beastmen previously unique to Faram Azula are back. Now Faram Azula feels just a smidge less special. It's the monstrous dog issue all over again. Even a few of the new enemies felt too overused, particularly Gravebirds. Decent enough enemy, a fairly cool and more mechanical complement to the Deathbirds. A bunch of them even attack you whilst you fight a Death Rightbird in Caro's Hidden Grave. I also like how most of them are perched motionlessly like statues, some of which actually are just statues, while others will come to life and attack you upon your approach. The issue for me is that they are everywhere. They're in Gravesite Plain, Shadow Altus, the Rau area, both the ancient ruins and the base, Cerulean Coast, Caro's Hidden Grave, Stone Coffin Fissure, Abyssal Woods, and even a couple of legacy dungeons. They're even in the final dungeon. I just think that's kinda lame. FromSoft definitely made some brilliant new enemies, but my god did they also milk some of them for everything they were worth. I have much the same to say about these Shadow Hornsent enemies who are also found nearly everywhere, also including legacy dungeons. The burlier ones found throughout Bayle Tower Settlement are great, or at least they are, until they leap 10 meters in your direction and nail you with their machete, and all of a sudden they're the worst enemy I've ever fought against. But then 20 seconds later I calm down and think, no, actually they're a pretty decent enemy. But then all of a sudden, and repeat. The issue with the Hornsent is that although they're new, and although their presence does have great significance to the story and history of the Realm of Shadow, they're not remarkable or interesting to look at or fight, regardless of how many of them the game throws at me at once. They're kind of boring. Way earlier in the video I mentioned that despite the cries and complaints of the DLC's excessive difficulty, some stretches of it actually felt too easy to me, and where I felt that most were in the large open sections littered with Hornsent and or a smattering of gravebirds. For as stunning and unique a level as it looks and feels to play through, the same is true of the Stone Coffin Fissure. Okay, there's a few blood fiends, or should I say sleep fiends, at the start, and a few grave birds, and then the weird eye things which now shoot lasers, which admittedly is awesome. But this place felt more like an exercise in forward navigation with a few enemies sprinkled in, rather than me feeling particularly challenged. Same with most of the Abyssal Woods, the most unique region of all, with the introduction of an enemy you are outright told you cannot kill, and that you must use stealth to bypass, even though you actually can kill them. There's tall grass placed here to hide yourself, not to mention special plants which can be used to draw away the attention of these untouchable tormentors. And it's cool, I appreciate it, but for me, the rest of the Abyssal Woods is a freaking snooze fest. We've got this vast, shrouded region infected with frenzy at the very depths of the Realm of Shadow. As the name suggests, this is the Abyss. But apart from the, 2 or 3 aging untouchable encounters, for the most part you're just trudging through this barren place and fighting the occasional group of rats, inquisitors, or sheep. It's not hard. Now, that's not to say that every enemy and level in FromSoft's games must be challenging to the max at all times, otherwise they suck. No. And obviously, the Abyssal Woods is heavily going for horror vibes here. These ground messages at the beginning are meant to get you nervous, meant to get you wondering and worried at what manner of monstrosity lurks deep within the fog. But for me, those intended feelings didn't stick around for very long. The first old untouchable encounter was really cool and tense, I was into it, but then as I came across pack after pack of rat, the tedium started to set in, and now here's the next aging untouchable, and oh shit, it's seen me, but oh, turns out you can just run away, and it's highly unlikely to ever touch you, which is ironic considering its name. And then eventually you make it to Midra's Manse, which, although a decent enough level featuring a truly tremendous boss fight, is also filled with Hornsent, rats and inquisitors. I don't mean to pick on the Abyssal Woods too much here, because I do respect it to some degree, but I think it's a good example of a level which is rather let down because of a lack of enemy variety and or quality. A common complaint I've seen about the DLC, perhaps the most common complaint actually, is that the world feels too empty, but I think that's tied to the enemy issue. There were stretches of the world that I'd be out exploring and I'd just feel unengaged because some places feel like they're underutilised. Like there'd just be a few wolves running around, or a few gangs of the marionettes which were already common as muck in the base game, or even nothing at all. I'll be diving into all the bosses shortly, but whilst we're on the topic of enemy variety, I do want to highlight one particular type of boss that also features somewhat too heavily here for my liking, and that type is of course dragons. Look, dragons are sick. I've got a whole video on the best and worst dragons to feature in FromSoft's games over the past decade, and also a video on dogs and cats. And that's because folk love dragons. They are grand, ferocious and mighty. Dragons are a spectacle, and they can come in a near infinite variety of shapes, sizes and colours. Even if we just look at FromSoft's catalogue, look at the difference in form, power and nature of the blue drakes from Dark Souls 1 compared to the dragon god from Demon Souls, or compare Osiros from Dark Souls 3 to Placidusax from Elden Ring. And speaking of Elden Ring, there were a ton of dragons in it of different elemental persuasions. Not to mention the different offshoot races such as the magma worms and the dragonkin, and I loved that. However, that whole draconic shtick did start to wear a wee bit thin after a while. Not because these dragons were unfun to fight, but because the fights with them tended to play out very similarly indeed to most of the others, except with an elemental and or status effect based variation here or there. So what does Shadow of the Erdtree bring to the table that's new in this regard? How have its dragons evolved from the base games? Well, you know how there were dragons who breathed fire, frost, deathblight, glintstone, glintstone again, and even scarlet rot? Well, now there's a ghost flame one, and a second, and a third. And while I don't dislike the idea of a ghost flame dragon, and while I certainly do think their deathly rotten appearances are badass as hell actually, at their core, these are still the same old dragon fights we experienced many times throughout the base game, but with a different element that was itself already present in the base game, though only really used by Death Rightbirds and the Fallen Hawk soldiers. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I didn't enjoy these actual fights. In fact, I had a really fun time fighting the one in Cerulean Coast in particular, due to how it summons undead warriors from the ground throughout the battle. This had the potential to be a major annoyance, but it's balanced out with the fact that the dragon's attacks often wipe out the very enemies it has summoned, which I find very fun. Mind you, can't say I'm so big a fan of the one in Shadow Altus. The idea of it is great, you and a cohort of Messmer's forces fighting against this foul frosty foe, but in practice it just evolves into the human enemies preferentially targeting you instead of the Dryan if you try and get close to fight the flippin' thing. It is very irritating trying to nail this boss whilst you've got a Black Knight or two firing great arrows at you instead of the fucking massive dragon destroying their campsite. You can try and just sit on the sidelines and watch them fight each other for a while, but it takes a bloody dog's age for all the soldiers to get wiped out if they ever get wiped out, which makes it all the more infuriating if you then die to the dragon afterwards because now everyone's revived again. I don't want to sensationalise or exaggerate my ill feelings on any element of this DLC though, even if that is what would get me the big views. I wasn't gritting my teeth and breathing heavily with outrage when I saw the 4th Ghost Flame Dragon, but rather I just thought, that's kinda lame. I'd have preferred they either had a different boss here or just not repeated it at all so many times. But they do repeat it, and not only that, but you fight a bunch more dragons during the Ascent of Jagged Peak, which play out exactly like generic base game dragon fights, and you can even fight a new ancient dragon which plays out nearly exactly like base game ancient dragons, except shittier in this case. Seriously, my first attempts at felling Senesax were miserable. Remember that inexplicably tanky ancient dragon that flies in from nowhere at the start of Farama's Ewa? It sucked. Well, Senesax is like that, but with the wholly unpleasant addition of water, and as has been the case in FromSoft's games ever since Dark Souls 1 I believe, lightning attacks get a nasty AoE after effect when used in shallow water, and the thing about ancient dragons is that they use a lot of lightning attacks, meaning this fight gets very messy. And oh, by the way, did you know that Senesax literally has more HP than Bayle? Why? Got to admit though, I had a significantly easier time with Senesax once I exclusively used Torrent. Riding in, getting in a few attacks on the legs and then riding off, rinse and repeat. Strangely however, on my New Game Plus 2 run, I decided to attempt this fight again, but solely on foot, and found it to be massively less of a pain in the arse than when I tried and failed to do it on my first playthrough. Don't know why. I'd love to give you an explanation as to why that was the case, but I can't. Don't know, I have no theories for you. Even after having beat it a few times now, I genuinely think there's an argument to be made that Senesax is the worst boss in the DLC. Not because it's difficult, but because it's unpleasant. Senesax? More like Senesucks. Senesax? More like Shittisax. Senesax? More like... Shadow of the Erdtree has a whole load of bosses in it, way more than I expected actually. There are a bit over 32 regular bosses, and then a further 11 remembrance bosses. Most a few of those regular bosses are ones that already appeared in the base game, like the Tibia Mariner, Tree Sentinel, Falling Star Beast, and the Death Rightbird. There are some really cool new ones, though even some of these are repeated within the DLC, like the Death Knights, the Great Red Bears, and of course, the aforementioned Ghost Flame Dragon, but enough about the goddamn Ghost Flame Dragon. Other than the dragons though, I'm mostly fine with the repetition of these newer bosses. There's nothing anywhere near as egregious as the multitudes of avatars and tree spirits thrown at us in the base game, though funnily enough, there actually are another 4 tree spirits in the DLC. But these are mini bosses, not bosses, so it's actually completely different. Before we get on to all the juicy remembrance bosses, let's discuss a few of the new lesser ones. Got to be honest here, I'm going to level with you, because I like you. Never been a big fan of rune bears. I remember first seeing them years ago when some of the big YouTubers got invited to take part in the network test a few months prior to Elden Ring releasing. Here's some vintage footage of the great Zuli the Witch getting into the Mistwood, which was supposed to be off limits for that test, and encountering one of the several rune bears prowling the area. They look awesome, especially with that massive rune hewn across their chest, but they're one of those enemies that I find to be an absolute bastard to actually fight. I can just never nail down the timings for their attacks, especially because some come out so suddenly and cover such a wide area due to their hulking hairy forms. I have very similar complaints with red wolves, though thankfully they do not appear in the DLC. The bears, however, are back, except bigger, redder, tougher, and significantly more horny. As in they have more horns, I mean, sprouting from their head, as opposed to, you know. There's a pair of them, Ralva, and then the even more challenging Regalia. Whatever their names are, these battles seldom go very well for me. It's nice to aim for a certain level of precision and general excellence with most bosses you fight in these games, but for some, like these ones, I have to just accept that I'm going to get hit a lot, and that I need to just power through regardless and heal a bunch and then hope I win. As chaotic as the battles are, and even though this isn't an all new boss type, but rather an evolution of the many rune bears we already saw in the base game, cool boss. And I love that they throw out beast style moves that mimic the types of attacks used by the likes of the beast clergymen. You get a sweet headpiece from Ralva too, that actually sported the full ensemble for a good chunk of my second playthrough, red bear claws and all. A real highlight for me was the Death Knights. Already spoke about the DLC's Black Knights, who themselves actually appear as bosses a couple of times, but in the realm of Shadow's deepest, darkest dungeons, standing sentinel before the only 2 Prince of Death appearances are the Death Knights. And these guys are even edgier than the already pretty damn edgy Knights Cavalry from the base game. Even though there are 2 of them, they're both respectably different enough from each other in that they wield different weapons. One has a set of twin axes, and the other has the long-hafted axe, each of which features the deathly mark of the centipede at the head, the same kind found on the mending rune of the Death Prince. Although the Death Knights do feature a sort of ghost flame coloured spectral cape, they don't throw out any attacks imbued with the ancient frozen fire, instead preferring lightning attacks, just a plain old yellow variant lightning too, none of this shit. The most outrageous attack by far though, and the one which catches near everyone out at least once, is their grab attack. Not sure exactly how much HP the Death Knight can recover with this attack, but every time I've been nailed by it, they've gotten it all back, which can be especially rough if you were close to winning the fight. Devastating grab attack or not though, just a cool boss with a fun moveset that doesn't take too long to learn, and for as panic inducing as some of its lightning tomfoolery can get, this is a respectably tight enemy that just feels good to get good at. It doesn't overstay its welcome. Here's a boss I don't so much care for though, the Golden Hippopotamus. Until recently, I thought this gross rat-looking porcupine hippo thing was mandatory because it guards the front entrance to Shadow Keep, but nah, you can get to Messmer by infiltrating into this specimen's storeroom via the church district, entered from the east side of the keep. The Golden Hippo is a weird boss for me because although I got powered by it at first, I remember thinking, okay, this thing hits hard, but it seems straightforward enough, even taking its more intimidating second form into account. But then, a strange thing happened. I just kept dying. Its moves really weren't that complex, but they kept hitting me and catching me out, especially that charging mouth grab attack. I hate how slowly the hippo moves throughout the first half of the attack because it tricks me into rolling too early, and then I get caught out because I'm still in the danger zone. I think what rubs me the wrong way with the Golden Hippo is that many of its attacks do that thing, where they go through the first portion of the animation, the boss holds that position, and then it very quickly and suddenly lashes out with the actual attack, in a way that's really difficult to time. The aforementioned Rune Bears and Red Wolves do the same thing, as do a bunch of other enemies in Elden Ring. A classic example of the kind of attack I'm talking about from FromSoft's older games would be the head charge move used by the Royal Rat Authority. Now, that was a shitty boss, for a few reasons, but one of the reasons was that attack. Also not a big fan of the Hippo's spinning quill shoot attack, because I still don't really understand it. It's one of those moves that breaks my brain a bit when I see it, and so it almost always hits me and occasionally kills me, quills me. It's still a fairly fun boss, and surprisingly challenging, at least for me, but I just do not gel with its moveset. You see a few other hippos stomping around elsewhere too, but they're just mini bosses for extra Shadow Tree fragments, are way weaker, and don't have that fancy second phase, so who cares. There are a few more new boss types in the DLC, but we haven't time to go through all of them. I definitely want to talk about the Remembrance bosses though, because they are definitely worth talking about. In this section I'll be discussing in some detail my thoughts on Rellana, Dancing Lion, Bayle and Messmer, and then for the other major bosses I'll keep my discussions slightly more brief, otherwise we'll be here all fucking day. This script has already taken me about 6 weeks to write, for Christ's sake. Also, I don't normally do this, but I'll be giving a tier rating for each boss, just for fun. We like to have fun here at Candle Type 1A Studios. Depending on the direction you head from the 3-path cross site of Grace where you meet Redmane Freya and the Hornsent, your first major boss will either be the Divine Beast Dancing Lion who sleeps tonight within Belrat's Tower Settlement, or Rellana Twin Moon Knight who guards the way forward to Shadow Altis from within Castle Ensis. For me, it was Rellana, and as expected, I struggled. Can I just say, by the way, how fantastic this boss's armour set looks, and how much I enjoyed wearing it afterwards? I did a video on my 50 favourite armour sets in FromSoft's games, if anyone's interested, and if the DLC had been out when I made that, Rellana's set definitely would have been included. Whereas Rellana's sister, Rennala, almost exclusively utilised sorcery to defeat you, Rennala's sister, Rellana, is the inverse. Being very much melee focused, though she does still throw out Carrion Phalanx style projectiles. Although some highly skilled and fast reflexed folk might have been able to suss out Rellana's shtick fairly quickly, for me I was getting wiped out very quickly upon entering through the fog. Thankfully, the damage done by her regular attacks isn't too insane, but those combos can be very demanding when you're first seeing them, and my lord do they seem to go on and on. I have been known to get a bit pissy are the sorts of bosses where learning them nigh on requires a certain number of strategic deaths before you eventually learn how to deal with them, but honestly, I never got that way with Rellana. She was just really good fun, though the damage increase she receives in Phase 2 as her right blade is imbued with royal magic and her left is imbued with Messmer fire did fry my ass nearly immediately the first few times I saw it, especially when the pillars of fire and the magic waves started getting chucked out. I love a magnificent attack. I love boss attacks where the animations just stick with you, where you're, shall we say, spellbound by how cool they are. And FromSoft's games are jam-packed with such attacks, one of which is present right here, with Rellana's Twin Moons. It is one of those moves where unless you're disgustingly fast to react, you are highly likely to get caught out by at least one of the 3 magic waves caused by it the first time you see it, but I don't even care. Got destroyed by it the first time I saw it, but I loved it so much that on the next attempt I damn well looked forward to her using it again. Moves that you can jump over are just so much fun. Rellana was also an interesting boss for me in that once I got over the initial difficulty hump, she was never a problem for me again on any subsequent playthroughs. Some other bosses got a bit easier on New Game Plus 1 and Plus 2, and some were a decent bit harder, but once I'd learned Rellana's initially complicated dance, I couldn't wait for more repeat performances. To describe a boss fight as being like a dance to be learned is kind of cliche at this point, I know, but it really is quite accurate here, especially when you take that enchanting soundtrack into account. I already love the track that plays whilst in the gravesite plane, but that's more of a feel, a mood builder, while this track is enchantingly energetic and flavourful. Rellana's a great boss that I enjoyed the crap out of, to put it poetically, and I am giving her an A+. But if you go the other direction and through Belrat, you come to the Divine Beast Dancing Lion. There's indications of the beast form beforehand of course, such as the statues, the headpiece which is so eerily situated in the storeroom occupied by the Hornsent Grandom, and of course, anyone who saw the gameplay reveal trailer back in June had already briefly caught sight of it in action. But god damn it if this isn't a top tier boss intro cutscene. Actually reminds me of Ludwig's intro cutscene. Both entities are very different in appearance, sure, but it's just the quiet, creepy way they are introduced with a lone speaker heralding their dreadful arrival, or activation in this case, with the motionless form of the leonine puppet coming to life at the behest of the Hornsent Grandom, now given motion via the furious dancing and cavorting of the two figures beneath the mask and robes. By the way, got to ask, does the dancing lion's face remind anyone else of Tom Cruise? Anyone? Come on. Honestly, I think out of any boss in the DLC, this is the one which made me smile the most. It made me say aloud, holy shit, this is awesome. The absurdly hype music, the whole dance aspect of it, and the way the animations for its moves are so cool and creative, especially the smaller details like the way it clacks its jaws before going in for the grab attack. Speaking of jaws, mine's dropped to the damn floor when I saw it shift into storm form for the first time, and then again when I saw its ice form, then yet again once the whirlwind started getting thrown out. I was blown away. Blow me, daddy. We know that these beasts were used for war. We even see several of them fighting against Messmer's forces in the story trailer. But they were also used for culturally significant performances. Indeed, the point of grace right outside its arena is called the stage front, and the one which appears after the boss has been defeated is called the Theatre of the Divine Beast. I just love the idea of these divine dance moves being used to fight enemies, and the lion's attacks are suitably flowing and even rhythmic to an extent. However, got to say, this is one of those bosses that I found myself disliking more and more every time I fought it. Once that initial awe at its appearance and its music had worn off, the mechanics of the fight left me feeling frustrated. As interesting as the lion's moveset is, I find it really awkward to deal with. Not just from a timing standpoint, but also because of the strangeness of the boss's form. This is a profoundly irregular shape for a foe to come in, and the cavorting nature of its movements means that it can be quite tricky to properly figure out its attacks, because so much of its body is constantly shifting and floating in a way that I find to be off-puttingly chaotic. And the whole affair starts getting even busier once the elemental attacks start getting thrown out. After 3 playthroughs and many attempts at the dancing lion, it remains one of those bosses that I consistently perform poorly at, and that makes it difficult for me to enjoy it in the way that I enjoy the other bosses. Even if I do dislike the dancing lion mechanically, the music, aesthetics and the sheer spectacle of it are valid components of the fight, so they should be taken into consideration when talking about its quality, and this definitely is a hell of a performance. I give it a C. Let's talk Bayle. First time I saw Bayle's name invoked was by the ghost in the Elder's hovel at the south of Gravesite Plain, with the spectre ranting about a dread tyrant Drake, one wounded but still seething with rage. The talisman of the dread is also sitting at the hovel, showing Bayle's terrible black visage and evil red eyes, with the item description reading, "Bayle was the foul dragon's name, a terrible harbinger of destruction, whose challenge to the ancient Dragon Lord ended in grievous mutual injury." Obviously the Dragon Lord referenced here is Placidusax, who is missing 2 of his 4 heads when fought in the Colosseum Beyond Time in Faram Azula, but there was no hint that I'm aware of in the base game as to how that actually happened. It was just a case of, here's this 4-headed dragon and oh by the way, half of its heads are gone. Excluding the Shadow Tree, one of the most eye-catching structures in the realm of Shadow is the Suppressing Pillar, essentially looking like a narrower Divine Pillar, and naturally, many players are going to want to head there to see what it's all about, but on the way, you hear a very alarming voice crying out in abject agony. You might not even immediately know where it's coming from because it's a big voice, but its origin is the crumpled, crippled bundle of skin and bone lying in the middle of the road, and again, Bayle's name is invoked, with this sorry, semi-scorched husk being the former Drake warrior, Egon, one who found honour and power through dragon communion, the act of devouring the hearts of fallen dragons so as to gain their strength. Egon will devolve into fearful fits of horror here as you talk to him, not even acknowledging your presence, and by this point I'm thinking, this Bayle fella sure sounds like something.
This guy's a real jerk.
Well, at the peak of Jagged Peak, Bayle's abode can be found, and it's a surprisingly beautiful arena, awash with beds of red flowers. And I've played FromSoft's games enough now to know that when I see an arena with flowers in it, I know some shit's going down. Indeed, the vast, terrifying form of Bayle the Dread descends from above, his black form emanating ancient fury and savage power. One of the most striking aspects of Bayle, apart from just how generally intimidating he looks, is also how horribly injured he is. The Talisman of the Dread mentions a grievous mutual injury, and while Bayle still retains his one and only head, his body has been brutalised. Left leg is completely gone, to the extent that he can only limp around the arena, albeit with frightful speed when attacking, and the right wing is in complete tatters with the bone horribly exposed, with the wounds still looking surprisingly raw and fresh. My favourite detail of all, and one that I didn't even notice until my second playthrough, was that not one, but two of Placidusax's heads are stuck to the back of Bayle's body, even after however many ages have passed since their brutal battle. It's not totally clear if Bayle is wearing the heads as morbid trophies, or as is probably more likely, he's unable to remove them at all due to his injuries and their awkward placement. FromSoft have made some badass looking dragon designs in their time, and while Placidusax still reigns as my absolute favourite design, Bayle's is a close second, specifically because of how much more grotesque he looks due to his scars and injuries, and I also like that because of his horns and red eyes, he kinda looks like Mohg, if Mohg were a dragon. One of the many aspects of Placidusax that made him so interesting was that he was the only dragon to breathe golden fire, though the Elden Beast does too, and tree spirits also have their golden flame explosions. Well, Bayle has his own signature element, but rather than it being just a new type of flame or merely a different colour of lightning, how about if we just combine fire and lightning into the one thing, and voila, you've got Bayle's Flame Lightning, dealing both fire and lightning damage, obviously. Enough about how incredibly gnarly looking Bayle is though. How is he to fight? Well, he's exactly how you would think. He's tough as balls. Every single attack is big and vicious, whether it's a wing and bite combo or a breath or bolt of flame lightning, and as you'd expect, he hits very hard. Crazy range too, especially his tail spin. There were so many times where he would be near at the other side of the arena and I would think there's no way he can get me from there, only for him to throw out the tail sweep and get me from there. Biggest issue for me early on though was his fire attacks. The slamming bolt attack was never much of an issue because even though it has a long animation, it's still clear enough when to roll, but I found myself getting really irritated at his downward breath attack. With this being a dragon fight, Bayle's head is a major weak point, and so you're going to want to get in there and hit it when you can, but this is not the sort of boss where you can simply wail on it with gay abandon. You'll frequently have to turn tail and flee from the fire. I found this quite annoying to be honest, because Bayle has a lot of HP, and you can go for a while without getting a clean shot at his head. Though I should mention that his rather gross leg stump also takes 50% extra damage if you prefer to focus on that, rather than to chill right in front of his massive face like me. I'm a mid-ear man though. I'm a tan man and a broochman, and as such, I like staying out in front for the occasional clean shot to the head when the opportunity presents itself. Bayle's moveset aside for a second, there is a massive variable here which goes a long way towards determining what sort of experience you have in this battle, and that variable is the aforementioned Egon, who can be summoned for the fight, appearing as he was in his prime for a final showdown with the only beast to ever make him feel true fear. My first few attempts at Bayle were done without Egon. 1, because I wanted to take in some of the flavour on my own first, and 2, because I somehow completely missed his bloody summon sign. I don't know how. I very rarely summon phantoms or spirit ashes for bosses, but due to the awesome way Egon is set up as a character, it really felt like FromSoft wanted us to summon him, and rightly so, because his presence significantly elevates the epicness of this fight.
I hereby vow you will rule today. Behold, the true great one, Egon. Your fear is slain.
God damn, it makes me happy when I hear that. However, just as is the case with pretty much every Elden Ring or indeed Dark Souls encounter, summoning drastically lowers the difficulty. With Egon along for the ride, I feel that the battle with Bayle is the most cinematic boss in the DLC because there's so much more room for error. His attention is divided, and those big explosive attacks in Phase 2 in particular are much more survivable. It's still a challenge to beat Bayle, but it's not a desperate struggle. Got to be honest though, just as Bayle struck fear into the heart of Egon, he did the same for old Candle Type 1A too. And for my first and second playthroughs, I did indeed summon Egon. For playthrough number 3 though, I said enough is enough. Curse you, Bayle! I hope my neighbours didn't hear that. And I fought him solo, meaning I had to really learn his moveset in a way that wasn't actually necessary before. It was hard, and I died a bunch, but got to say, I loved the process of getting better at this boss. The strategic waiting around for opportunities to strike the head, while slow at times, was rewarding, and for as intimidating as Phase 1 felt at first, after a while it just became a hurdle to vault before making it onto the far more intense Phase 2. Bayle's Phase 2 transition is terrifying because directly after gaining new spectral wings of fire, he always launches into flight, and before you know it, he's out of sight, and there are fireballs being rained down upon ye, and oh shit, here he comes, and oh f***, explosions, and lots of them. The flame lightning aspect is dialed up to the volcanic max here, and if you're anything like me, you probably had no idea how on earth to deal with it at first, leading to some swift demises, and then back to Phase 1. Bayle can repeat the flying fireball attack many more times throughout the fight too, but the most dangerous move is whatever the hell this one's called. Again, just overwhelming and potentially disorienting if you lose your lock-on, which does happen sometimes, leading to much frantic twirling of the camera to try and spot where you're going to fly in from before it's too late. Really fun move to deal with when you understand it a bit more though. I enjoy the way the fire wave converges in on you while you have to immediately turn and react to the flame lightning breath, followed by an additional explosion afterwards just to ruin your day. I don't think I've ever actually managed to dodge all 3 hits of this attack. I always get hit by at least one of them. One day though. One day. I found opportunities for damage to be far scarcer in Phase 2 because Bayle's threat level is significantly increased to the extent that it's just scarier to be near him, and a higher proportion of my time tends to be spent just trying to not get hit. For example, in this footage it only took me around half a minute to get through Phase 1, but once the transition happened, it took me an additional 4 minutes to end him. But beat him I did, without the arrows from Egon's great bow, his dragon communion harpoons, or his tremendous voice. Didn't necessarily love Bayle at first and found him to be quite problematic to deal with, which is part of the reason why I resorted to summoning Egon for 2 playthroughs, but I'm super glad I went on to take him on solo because it was an absolute thrill. I got that classic sought-after feeling of accomplishment after striking the final blow after a long, hard battle. Until now, Placidusax has been my all-time favourite dragon boss from any FromSoft game. I really loved that fight. But despite Bayle the Dread having failed to dethrone the mighty Dragon Lord from a lore perspective, he does now reign supreme as my Dragon Lord. Bayle, you have stolen my heart. But now it's time for me to eat your heart. I hereby award Bayle an S rank. The 4th major boss I would like to talk about here, and one extremely significant to the story, is Bayle. Again. No, it's Messmer. Messmer the Impaler, which also makes this a good time to discuss more story. So when I saw people discuss or complain about the difficulty of the final boss, I assumed it would be either Miquella or Messmer, because Messmer is the one clearly painted as the main villain. He's on the front cover, and that's why I was worried when I got to the top of Shadow Keep and found him there. One aspect of the base game that I felt a sort of anxiety over was its conclusion, as in I had no idea when or where it would come. I remember defeating Godric and then Rellana for their great runes, only to hear Enya and the Two Fingers tell me it was now time to journey to the Erdtree for an audience with Queen Marika so as to become Elden Lord, to which I thought, but what about all the other stuff? I'd barely explored Caelid and I hadn't even had a sniff of the other demigods mentioned by Gideon, and here the game was telling me that it was time to prepare for the end. As I later found out, the game certainly does not end when you make it to the Erdtree for the first time, but I didn't know that, and it made me paranoid that I would prematurely finish the game and confused about what I did and didn't have to do. Well, I didn't quite feel those same levels of confusion here, but I did get a wee bit concerned when I first saw Messmer, because I didn't want the DLC to end yet. I was having a great time. Turns out, again, there's plenty more stuff still to be done after this. Messmer is certainly not the final boss, though he is one of the very few mandatory ones, because you need his inner kindling to burn away the sealing tree obscuring Enir Ilum, where the Divine Gate is to be found. The same one used by Marika in the story trailer, and the one which, by this point, Miquella has passed through while the world waits his return. I was captivated at every line of dialogue during the Messmer cutscenes. I was way into the story, fascinated by the realm of shadow and dying to know what Miquella was up to, and indeed, Messmer's role in this lost land is a very interesting one. Although he's painted as a merciless monster responsible for the burning and slaughtering of untold multitudes of Hornsent and their cities and settlements, and although this is true, he is that monster, it's because his mother, Queen Marika, commanded it thus. Messmer and his legions are here in the realm of shadow at Marika's behest, to wage a never-ending war against the Hornsent. A people who she detests, people with no allegiance to the Erdtree, and the same ones who wiped out and sacrificed her shaman kin from their home. Just as Needle Knight Leda says, the Hornsent were never saints, a morbid choice of words considering the process of sainthood practiced by the Hornsent, which truly might be one of the most horrifying ideas introduced in any FromSoft game. I think the pot saints are just as, if not more disturbing than the patients found in Bloodborne's research hall. The people of Marika's village were known as shamans, whose flesh were said to mend harmoniously with others. Not the most straightforward of wording there, but when you delve down into the underground jails, you are presented with the gruesome truth, where shamans and the sliced up remains of prisoners were stuffed in jars and joined together as singular tortured entities, screaming masses of swollen flesh beyond all hope and help, all at the hands of the Hornsent. In particular, their masked potentates, such as can be found in Bonnie Village, were the ones who directly carried out the butchering phase of the whole horrific process, wielding their wicked knives and wearing their distinctive caterpillar masks, the same manner of mask that happens to be worn by the Hornsent. As disturbing as the jails are, a place that I found even worse is the one found deep within Shadow Keep, with its profusion of flesh, filth, broken pots and shambling, shrieking horrors. Really confused me at first actually, because I wondered why the hell this place was here. It made no sense to me that a place where shaman sainthood was still being practiced would be here in Shadow Keep, which is controlled by Messmer and his forces who would be completely against it. Then I realised that for as gruesome as it appears, this is supposed to be a sort of clinic for the saints, where efforts were made to separate out the fused flesh, perhaps to free and restore the long-suffering shamans within. But that clearly these attempts were completely in vain, with the clinic and its wretched patients now being abandoned. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Pot Saints for me is the question of why it was done to begin with. What possible use could the Hornsent have had for creating these abominations? I guess the use of the word saint implies a religious reason, where the practicality or even morality of it was irrelevant. Perhaps it was simply something they did for cultural or ceremonial purposes that could only really be understood and appreciated by themselves, while looking like nothing more than cruel barbarism to outsiders, and certainly the victims. Thus, Marika had good reason to desire the eradication of the Hornsent, and this is communicated beautifully when you walk into the shaman village. Such an overwhelmingly lovely location with its humble brick houses and profusion of multicoloured flowers. This place should have been occupied by Marika's people and herself, them living their lives in peace, but instead it is completely bereft of life, with a minor Erdtree radiating rays of gold for the benefit of no one. Trust FromSoft to create perhaps the most beautiful ever area, and at the same time make it completely depressing. Marika was a central figure in Elden Ring's base game, but she was also one we never actually directly communicated with, and almost all the information about her was of a near mythical nature. She was, after all, a god, and judging by the state of the lands between and the cursed and corrupted nature of all her demigod progeny, she was far from being any sort of good or wise god. However, the DLC gives us a far more substantial view of her background and a motive for her decision to become a god, and for other decisions, like how she likely removed the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring so that never again could her people be eradicated. She would change the literal nature of reality to prevent that from happening again. But it was not Marika herself who would wage the holy war in the realm of shadow, but instead her son, Messmer, followed there by Rellana, Gaius, and great numbers of Black Knights and Fire Knights, with legions of prisoners from the lands between to make up the army. They were there to lay waste to the graceless heathens in this foreign land, and then return home as heroes, but in reality, Marika never really planned for them to return. They were effectively abandoned as soon as they crossed the threshold, even if they didn't yet know it. There are numerous Marika statues throughout the realm of shadow, but something you quickly notice is that they are all decapitated. Now, it's possible that this was done by the Hornsent in defiance of the evil army occupying their homeland, but these statues are mostly located in places still occupied by Messmer's forces, with the implication being that they turned against Marika after eventually realising that their god had abandoned them to this strange world, and that they were never going home. The one and only Marika statue that still retains its head is the one located within Messmer's boss arena, which goes towards the tragedy of this character. Because of all the ones she abandoned and effectively exiled, not too dissimilarly to how she did to the Tarnished, the one she betrayed the most grievously was her son, her cursed son. The slithering serpentine appearance of Messmer's inner fire and the fact that he keeps his twin-winged serpents as constant companions is not coincidental, because Messmer's very soul is corrupted by the troubling presence of the base serpent, also known as the Abyssal Serpent, a reptilian inner entity which is constantly feasting on his inner fire. Messmer reveals the serpent within in the Phase 2 transition, where he resigns himself to his true nature and fate, destroying the seal of grace planted in his right eye socket by Marika, and rendering himself now as graceless as us, and ready to unleash the parasitic monster living within his own cursed flesh. Never mind the lore though, how's the fight? I mean, come on, what are we doing here? This is an S tier boss. It's one of the best bosses FromSoft have ever made, top freaking 5 I think. Brilliant mix of tricky spear combos and flame explosions with moves that just feel fun to learn. One of the most bothersome attacks for me was that scraping follow-up attack he sometimes does, because it's one of those that's designed to trick you into rolling early and getting nailed once the roll is over, and it did trick me many times, but not in a bullshit way, more in a fun, you got me sort of way. I think the difficulty level of Messmer is one of the things I like most about him, because although his attacks do hit hard, he doesn't have an insane amount of health, and for as fast as he is, there are plenty of opportunities to deal damage once you start to work out the length and timing of his furious attacks and combos. One issue I heard of some people having with the DLC was the general speed of the bosses. I'd heard that colossal weapons were barely viable now, because everything's too damn fast, but I just never found that to be the case at all. I used colossal weapons a bunch, and at times even dual wielded them, and it worked just fine, especially with the massive damage bonuses from the Erdtree blessings, which are nice with swifter dex weapons, but which are a delight with the strength focused ones when you're dealing thousands of damage per hit. We haven't spoken about Messmer's second phase yet though, and this is where I usually start to panic, because honestly, I still don't quite know how to reliably dodge the snake combos. They scare the shit out of me and can quickly end the current attempt. He still retains many of the same moves from phase 1, but there's always the risk of him transforming at any time and taking you out from across the arena with a vicious bite. I kinda like how phase 2 scares me though. Reminds me of Orphan of Cause from Bloodborne a bit, in that although I really like that boss too, I will never be comfortable with its second phase. It's just too damn hectic. With his dying breath, Messmer finally, after all this horror and fire and slaughter at her command, allows himself to curse Marika, just as she had cursed him by sending him to the realm of shadow in fear of his base serpent, but also in a sense, long before that. Messmer didn't ask to be corrupted, he was born that way, just as all of Marika's children were, with the exception of Godwyn the Golden, though even he would later become the Prince of Death. Messmer is a monster, but he purposely became one so as to draw a portion of ire away from his mother and onto himself out of pure sacrificial devotion. Even after what she'd done to him, he still kept the faith and never forsook her, even after all this time. It was only after a Tarnished entered his chamber and forced him to give in to the Abyssal Serpent, leading to him dying a rotten, graceless death, that he finally cursed her. Excellent character, complex villain, and a top tier boss. Now how about we cover the rest of the major bosses? I won't go into them in quite as much detail as I did for the previous 4, but still got to discuss them because I actually think they're almost all of a very high quality. First, the Putrescent Knight. Straight bloody A tier boss. Didn't exactly know what to expect after jumping down from the coffin at the end of Stone Coffin Fissure, and even once the knight showed up I still didn't know exactly what I was looking at, but this fight is about as solid as they come, and an excellent twist on the mounted boss, with how its horse is able to submerge into the Putrescent's ground and come back up again elsewhere. Really fun moveset to contend with, and it felt fantastic to nail down that long spinning combo with the 2 horse charges, and I love the Ghost Flame wave where you need to jump backwards instead of forwards. I know it's not that hard to avoid, but it makes me feel like an absolute beast when I time it perfectly. Putrescent Knight killed me a whole bunch of times on my first playthrough, which can become quite grating depending on the nature of the boss doing the killing, but I just never got all that upset here. It's just a fun fight, though admittedly having to fall all the way down to the base on every attempt is kinda lame. Next, the Erdtree avatar. I give it a B. I've had a few people now say that they did not enjoy this fight much at all, with some even having struggled against it, but I've never had any major issues myself. Absolutely gorgeous arena and a tremendous visual design for a boss, particularly in phase 3 where it arranges itself into the shape of the Erdtree for its golden flash. Very creative and cool. I don't really find its moveset to be too problematic to deal with, although it can get a bit busy, especially when it starts heaving its flowery form from one side of the arena to the other from phase 2 onwards. I like how you do way more damage to the head, because it just makes it feel more satisfying when you do land a good clean hit there and see how much it took off its life bar and you think, hey, this isn't so bad. And then it comes back for phase 2 with a totally refreshed life bar and an expanded moveset. But then you kill it and you think, hey, that wasn't so bad. Oh come on, this is getting silly now. Maybe if the Erdtree avatar battle wasn't such a visual feast with such a great soundtrack, I wouldn't be so well disposed towards it. But the fact is that I have a fun time fighting it on every playthrough. In fact, I look forward to this fight. Commander Gaius, god, this guy's such a bore. I'm going to hand out another B for this one, though if you'd asked me for my rating a month back, it probably would have been a C. Although I do like the way Gaius is situated, it's also slightly odd. The way you just come out of the back of Shadow Keep, and then with zero fanfare or explanation, there's just this weird dude riding on a board charging at you from the distance. It's like, who are you? Speaking of charging, yep, I don't have any controversial takes as far as that attack is concerned. It's excessively difficult to avoid in a way that just doesn't feel right. Got to be so precise with your timing and only dodge in the last 10th of a second. But the issue is that attempting to do that often means you leave it slightly too late and get hit anyway. Gaius was probably the first boss from the DLC, but I thought his damage might have been a bit too high. He's got this big combo he does a lot, that goes on for a while, is difficult to dodge on the last couple of hits, and does insane damage even if you do get hit at the tail end of it. I can't remember what my Shadow Tree Blessing level was when I got to Gaius, though it would have been respectably high because I was exploring quite a lot, but even so I got smashed into oblivion a bunch of times here, especially when he goes all Radahn mode in Phase 2. I had a rough time with Gaius for a while, and even on my second playthrough I still hadn't quite taken to him, but now, gotta say, I do enjoy fighting him. He's surprisingly difficult for a boss that just sort of appears out of nowhere, but once I did figure out how to deal with most of his attacks and that big combo he does, it was actually a really enjoyable fight with a lot of movement around a big open battlefield. Damn decent stuff. And now for Meter, Mother of Fingers. Gotta be a C from me. I found Count Emir's explanations into the nature of the two fingers and the greater will to be fascinating because there's so much mystery surrounding it all, and the nature of the world, and what strange places and higher beings lie beyond it. I was extremely hyped when I was warped to Meter's incredible arena and saw her immense grey form in the distance, and the words Mother of Fingers appear at the bottom of the screen, so I really just didn't expect this sort of thing from the DLC. Meter's remembrance even describes her as being a literal daughter of the Greater Will, which I just find to be super interesting. The cosmological aspect of Elden Ring is fascinating. As for the fight though, I don't like it as much as I want to. Meter is a large creature with many digits, and so the fight is a far cry from the swifter and more precise experiences offered by the likes of Rellana or Midra. But as with a couple of other bosses I've already discussed, she has a moveset I just don't quite gel with. I find a lot of her attacks to be awkward and unenjoyable to avoid, and when it comes to her massive laser attack, I still don't understand how the hell to not get hit by the first one. Meter's not a bad boss or anything, in fact I don't think any of the major DLC bosses are bad, but for as much as I love her arena, her design and her lore, I don't love the actual fight, and I'm always quite glad when she's over and done with. Now on to Midra, Lord of Frenzied Flame. S-. Absolutely brilliant boss fight. Enjoyed the hell out of him on my first attempt, and I continued to enjoy him every subsequent time I fought him too. Having to go through the whole bloody Mist Noble-esque preliminary phase every time is a tad annoying and unnecessary, but it hardly ruins the experience. The main thing I love about Midra is the rhythm of his attacks. There are lots of Elden Ring bosses where when you're new to fighting them you're going to get hit a lot, simply because you don't know their attacks and combos. Got to get hit enough times before you learn when to roll and when to hit back. With Midra though, it's just so smooth, so instinctual, everything just makes sense, at least to me, and even on the first and second attempts, I found myself naturally rolling at the correct times, because his attacks and movements are so logically and rhythmically animated. Although you might think it sounds slightly petty, the only thing keeping me from giving Midra a straight S rather than an S- is that I don't think he's hard enough. Now that's not to say that I think this fight would be better if he required like 50 attempts to beat rather than say 5, but I do think Midra could have done with a bit of buffing up, maybe a bit more HP, and he's harder to stance break, I don't know. I guess I just wanted it to last longer, that's what she said. Let's talk Ramina, Saint of the Bud, A tier boss. The whole half woman, half beast has been done by FromSoft before, of course. There's Quilana with the lower body of a spider, and then Scorpioness Nashka with the body of a scorpion, hence the name. Ramina, on the other hand, is 1/3 woman, 1/3 centipede, and 1/3 scorpion, and also she uses butterflies to attack you. And there's a boatload of scarlet rot thrown into the mix as well. You can briefly see Ramina in the story trailer, kneeling within a burning church, presumably the very church you fight her in. Her remembrance implies that she might be the creator of the Scarlet Rot, which I found to be an odd detail, because the Scorpion Stinger dagger found in the Lake of Rot's Grand Cloister is described as glistening with scarlet rot and the relic of a sealed outer god, which obviously is not describing Ramina. Maybe she simply rediscovered the rot, or through happenstance became an ideal host for it, just as Malenia later would. Or maybe the lore can be unnecessarily confusing sometimes, even bordering on contradictory, but it's just vague enough that FromSoft can get away with it, whilst you struggle to make it all make sense in your head. You do the work. Anyway, Rellana was one of those bosses where I didn't really know what I thought of her after my first playthrough or even my second, simply because she was way too easy, by far the easiest major boss in the DLC, at least for me. As such, never got a chance to really experience or learn her, but after sparring with her some more in playthrough number 3, I got the picture, and yeah, really great boss. I'm not even entirely sure calling Rellana easy is the correct descriptor, but rather, somewhat similarly to Midra, her attacks just make sense to me. That might sound odd, considering she's a pink centipede scorpion lady who throws out exploding butterflies, but what can I say? She makes for a very enjoyable boss with very enjoyable moves. Dodging her cross-arena slashes and then follow-up butterfly explosions is brilliant fun, and I'm a big fan of that brief flash her body does the instant before she lands her poison flower blooms twice attack. That's a damn cool way to telegraph an attack, even if I do always end up getting hit by it anyway, always. But now, dear viewers, finally I would like to discuss the final encounter of the DLC, the subject of all the controversy. A boss which made a lot of even the most seasoned Soul players stop and say, okay FromSoft, Orphan of Cause, Sister Frieda, Ishin Sword Saint and Millennia Blade of Miquella are one thing, but you guys are taking the piss now. Yes, oh yes indeed, promised consort Radahn is an extraordinarily difficult foe, though first I would like to talk about the story side of things, related to why he's even here in the first place. As excited as I was for Shadow of the Erdtree, I did not power through the whole thing over the first weekend of it coming out, but rather savoured the experience over a couple of weeks, meaning compared to a sizable portion of the Elden Ring fanbase, I was late as hell at making it to the end. Even so, players were surprisingly great about spoilers, to the extent that through it all, I really didn't know who the final boss was going to be, though of course I assumed it would be Miquella in one form or another. Although I love the lore of Elden Ring and enjoy the odd lore video from time to time, I don't really read or take part in discussions and debates around it on Reddit and such. I'm not a part of the lore community, but from what I've read since, seems like a lot of people were really hoping that the final encounter would involve Godwyn. That Miquella's consort would be that golden demigod of legend who we only ever got the briefest of glimpses of as he was in his prime, before his soul would be slaughtered on the night of the Black Knives, resulting in the propagation of his grotesque and ulcerated new form as the Prince of Death throughout the lands between, and even parts of the Realm of Shadow. However, through dialogue with Freya and Sir Ansbach, it becomes revealed that Radahn is to be Miquella's chosen consort. Other than the growths found at the bottom of the Fog Rift and Scorpion River catacombs, Godwyn is not a part of the Shadow of the Erdtree cast. Like I said earlier, I inadvertently cocked up Ansbach and Freya's questlines by wandering too far into Aenir Ilum, and so, unlike for many others, for me the Radahn revelation only came at the very end. I heard Freya's line about Miquella and Radahn making a vow, and that supposedly the Realm of Shadow was where it would be honoured, but that wasn't enough for me to guess. But yes, although we reign supreme as the champion of the Radahn Festival! Concluding in the death of the rotted and bestial demigod, he has returned, thanks to the second way which Mohg was exploited by Miquella. As we discussed already, Miquella required Mohg's power to get to the Realm of Shadow, and by the time we reach Morgwyn Palace, he's long since passed over, leaving the bewitched Omen demigod behind, who remains under the assumption that he's the one to be Miquella's consort. Well, after we defeat Mohg, his body would not go to waste. Rather, it was stolen away and somehow delivered to Miquella at the Gates of Divinity. It's not outright stated who it was who absconded with the body, but the most likely answer is Needle Knight Leda. She's by far the most fervent of Miquella's followers, and it's her you see within Morgwyn Palace by the Cocoon of the Empyrean after the fight with Mohg. So that's a physical vessel sorted, we've got that sorted lads, but how about the soul? We already defeated Radahn on the Crimson Sands of Caelid. We beat him and he is dead, so how is he here again? Well, the Radahn Festival was a necessary step in this entire process because it quite literally freed his soul. This is why Godwyn could never have been Miquella's consort. It's because his soul was annihilated by the Black Knife assassins while the body lived on. And while Radahn's body and wits were crudely affected by the rot from Malenia's Scarlet Bloom, his soul was still intact, only trapped in a corrupted body. Defeating Radahn released his soul, which would have migrated to the realm of shadow, it being the place where, quote, all manners of death wash up. Thus, at the gates of divinity, Radahn's soul was able to take hold within the dead body of Mohg, allowing the so-called strongest of all the demigods to return to the world as he was in his prime, to fulfill his role as Miquella's promised consort. Me, myself personally, as a person, I actually just completely missed the whole Mohg vessel aspect on my first playthrough, because it's really not clear just to look at Radahn here that he's in Rogue, that he's in Mohg's body. I mean, looks nothing like Mohg. The only giveaways are that he has a blood flame attack and that there are horns sprouting from his arms, which at first glance look like they might simply be part of his armour. That aside though, hot dog, the young lion looks awesome here, far more glorious and refined than the hulking, crazed monster we fought at Caelid. I certainly did feel quite hyped at the reveal, but gotta be honest, I definitely was a bit perplexed too. I just remember thinking, Radahn? Just because the finer points of the lore eluded me. Like I said, I did not expect this at all. Funnily enough, I remember feeling similarly when I saw Gale at the end of the Ringed City in Dark Souls 3. I was filled with anticipation and excitement at the thought of what epic foe might await me here at the end of Souls. And then I saw Gale and said, who the f*** is this guy? Even though Gale had already appeared earlier in the DLC and in the previous DLC. But what can I say, I was an ignoramus. And despite my initial confusion then, Gale would go on to be my all-time favourite FromSoft boss. But what about promised consort Radahn? What's the verdict on the young lion? Well, for clarity, all my playthroughs as well as all footage here happened before patch 1.14, where his difficulty got nerfed. Important to say that first. The patch actually came out while I was writing this script, and it annoyed me, not because I think Radahn shouldn't have been patched, but because it meant I had to rewrite a couple of sections. Have some bloody consideration for poor old candle type 1A please, would you, FromSoft? Over my 3 playthroughs of the DLC, my opinion on promised consort Radahn has undulated. It has undergone undulation. The damn notoriety around him had me expecting a long and brutal boss experience that was going to take several days to clear, maybe even a week, who knows. And upon fighting him, gotta say he was pretty much exactly as difficult as everyone was saying. They weren't bullshitting. Young Radahn is one tough customer. The first phase is surprisingly conventional in a way that I really like. It's a big tough badass with a big pair of swords, and he hits hard with suites of savage earth-shaking combos at his disposal. Yes, he certainly has some fancier tricks like his flying gravity projectile swarm and his long-range shockwave, which draws you in from afar for 1 or 2 potential follow-up moves, either the outward radiating magic attack or his double sword combo, but for the most part this is one of those bosses where you just need to bash your head against him a lot before you manage to learn the right timings for his combos, when they end, and all potential follow-ups. There are some bosses that I find very hard that I do not terribly enjoy. As some of you who have watched my other videos on bosses will know, I do not enjoy Malekith, and the main reason for that is that I find him to be extremely difficult. Even now, with me having played through Elden Ring so many times, Malekith still has a couple of attacks where, if he uses them, I just can't seem to not panic, and I inevitably get hit and usually killed because of how high his damage is, and the health draining Black Flame effect. Malenia is another boss that can be something of a misery for me, though that's not because I dislike her as a whole. I actually love 90% of her moves, but because I detest Waterfowl Dance in particular. And I'm not much of a fan of that Valkyrie clone attack either that she does in Phase 2. Promised Consort Radahn's first phase, however, is an example of a fight that I also find to be very, very hard, but that I love. Going up against his combos the first time and getting pounded into dust, or getting caught out by a delayed finisher, or his Godfrey style quake as he tears his sword free of the ground is rough, but it's all made right by how satisfying it feels to finally nail that shit down. That feeling of lasting a full minute without taking any damage from Radahn here is sublime, and for me, the only other fight that comes close to matching the pace and intensity of this battle is the one with Godfrey, though of course Radahn is far more difficult than the Elden Lord. It's not all sunshine and rainbows though, because, and it pains me to have to bring this up because it's the same thing everyone else brings up, his 3-hit cross combo can suck a dick. The first hit almost always comes out faster than you can reasonably react, and even if you do avoid it, you're getting hit by the second, and perhaps the third due to being rattled by the injustice of it. There are actually ways to avoid this attack, so I don't want to pretend that it's impossible to avoid all damage here, but it really is remarkably, unreasonably tough to not get hit by one of those 3 attacks, to the extent that I and many others expected it to get patched. Except a month went by and no patch. Then 2 months and no patch. And then 3 months went by and... oh wait, yeah, they patched it. For clarity, I haven't actually fought post-patch Radahn yet, but I do know this notorious sword combo was made much more reasonable to deal with now, which I'm fine with. This wasn't just a difficult to avoid attack that was made easier, but rather a borderline broken one that was fixed. It wasn't the only problem attack in Elden Ring's history, of course. There's also the aforementioned waterfowl dance, Radagon's 3-hit hammer slam, that quake type attack used by the god-devouring serpent, and I guess while we're speaking about annoying attacks, the Godskin Noble's rolling attack is weird too. It's not that it's super difficult to dodge, but rather, it just goes on for about twice as long as it feels like it should. A slightly different example is of course Mohg's Nihil attack, because this is a very rare example of unavoidable damage in a FromSoft game. Even if you use the Purifying Crystal tier, you still take damage, it's just significantly reduced. Though I guess it is technically possible to take out Mohg before he even makes it to phase 2 if you're strong enough, but that's obviously not the intended design of the fight. While perhaps I shouldn't go into these games expecting to technically be able to avoid every single attack as long as I play well enough, the fact that 99.5% of attacks can be avoided with skillful enough play makes those 0.05% of attacks that either cannot be avoided or are unreasonably difficult to avoid feel odd, like they've broken some unwritten rule. I've gone off on a bit of a tangent here though, so let's go back to Promised Consort Radahn. Folks, as we know, there's more to this battle than just what I've spoken about thus far, because after losing 35% of his HP, for the first time in the DLC, we actually see Miquella, and for the first time in the entirety of Elden Ring, we hear him too. Though this character's real life voice actor is actually a woman. In fact, it's the same voice actress who voiced Wee Blue Johnny from The Witcher 3.
Whiskey! Slither! Ringworm! Rubbish! Bumblebee! Flabbergasted! Ha! The sound of it!
Oh, shut up, Johnny. Radahn emerged from the Divine Gate in his new pseudo-omen shell as the Lord and Consort of an imminent new age, and indeed, Miquella makes his divine return after having shed all his flesh, his heart, his eye, his doubt and vacillation, and even his sense of fear and love. Such is the toll demanded to achieve godhood, just as Marika did who knows how long ago at this same holy site, to initiate her own age, one which would ultimately lead to the ruin of everyone and everything across her domain, and to her own divine imprisonment within the literal symbol of her reign. Despite the relinquishment of all his flesh, Miquella possesses a new form which gives off a white gold incandescence, but which is still partially marred by the acts of self-mutilation necessary for his ascendance. You can see his left arm is still gone just past the shoulder, but with a new spectral arm on each side to replace that which was sacrificed. Whereas Radahn's first instinct upon our arrival was to vanquish the foe in front of him, Miquella's is to attempt to turn us to his cause, to add us as the foremost of his followers, just as he had, with bewitching manipulation, to Sir Ansbach, Mohg, and Tolier, and perhaps even his own brother, Radahn. It's left somewhat ambiguous as to whether or not Radahn was at all complicit in this entire plan of Miquella's, and he may well be at least partially under his spell, even whilst fighting you here. The first phase of this fight is very tough, but I also think it is absolutely fantastic and profoundly satisfying to slowly learn to the point where, you'll probably still die to it a lot, you can get pretty damn slick at getting through it. The second phase, however, is on a whole other level, and that is because of Miquella. Comparisons have been made between this boss and the twin princes from Dark Souls 3, and for good reason. Both battles have you facing an enormous legendary warrior in phase 1 before a physically smaller combatant joins the fight in phase 2, hanging off the shoulders of the first warrior, and furthermore, in both fights the combatants are siblings. In Dark Souls 3, however, Prince Lothric is still taking part in phase 1 to an extent, because while he is out of harm's way, he's the one teleporting his brother Prince Lorien around the arena. It's a really cool boss mechanic, and I love this fight. In the second phase, Lothric joins the battle and complements Lorien's purely physical moveset by throwing out multitudes of glimmering holy projectiles, as well as larger soul spear-like ones. It makes the battle harder and more intense, but not to an extreme level. You've just got more things to worry about. Well, the second phase of this battle is far, far more intense. Whilst Radahn still retains most of his moveset from phase 1, nearly every one of his attacks is followed up by the lights of Miquella, sometimes beaming up from the ground directly in front of him and other times being a full-blown circular AoE of effect attack. And these are both disorienting and devastating, even if you're geared up with decent holy resistance armor and talismans. Radahn's most disorienting moves of all though are his new ones, particularly his light speed slashes where he sends successions of phantom clones at you before swooping in for the final swipe, in a way that will probably make you exclaim, "What the f*** is even happening right now?" Phase 1 is overwhelming at first, but it's still comprehensible even when you are getting wrecked by heavy hitting 6-hit combos, but Phase 2 is blinding, blasting and brutal. There's so much more going on, and these extra attacks and projectiles can very easily delete most of, if not your entire health bar before you even know what hit you. And in true Radahn fashion, he also has a crashing meteor attack that is thrown out at around 25% HP, which can swiftly, surely and painfully end an otherwise auspicious attempt at this bloody bastard of a boss. One attack I do love though is the grab attack, where Radahn scoops you up in his arms so that Miquella can whisper honeyed words in your ear. Doesn't damage you at all, but a gold circlet of light appears over your head, meaning if you get caught out by that grab once more then the attempt is over, not as a result of divine annihilation, but from having your heart stolen for eternity. Such is the power of God Miquella, even after the shattering of his great rune. The broken rune in question, as dropped by the Erdtree avatar, can be used here to nullify the effect, which is a really nice feature. It's cool when FromSoft add in an optional external item which has special properties used for a particular boss fight, like what Dark Souls 1 did with the silver pendant in the Manus fight. And saying that though, I think I would have preferred it if you couldn't get rid of the circlet of light at all. It would add so much more tension to the fight if you've been tagged by the grab once already and you know you must not get caught by it again. And also, once you recognise the attack, it's really easy to avoid. In fact, I usually hope Radahn throws it out because of how easily punishable it is. Aside from the general intensity and busyness of this battle, one of the most common complaints I've seen relates to Miquella's lovely hair, which has flourished to an outlandish length as a result of his ascension. I wish I had hair like that, but I'm nearly 32 and it's rough up there these days. The complaint in question is that the hair is too vast and distracting to the point where it can be hard to get a sufficiently good read on what Radahn is actually doing, exacerbating the already dazzling and constant light show. Although I get where people are coming from here, personally it never bothered me nor impacted my ability to tell one attack from another, but this was another aspect that was nerfed in patch 1.14, where the lights were made to not be so disorienting and distracting, and apparently the particle effects were even causing slowdown in some people's PCs. I don't want to minimise other people's struggles, but sometimes when people find something excessively difficult, there can be a reflexive compulsion to exaggerate problems with the thing that that person is struggling with. Most of us have felt this before for all sorts of things in life, because feelings of failure and inadequacy are unpleasant, and I think FromSoft's games in particular are good, or should I perhaps say bad, at evoking such bitter feelings. This is the kind of fight where the first time you make it to the second half, you're likely going to get destroyed in about 3 seconds flat. and then the next time you make it, you're probably going to last about 3 seconds again. And then the next time after that, maybe 3.1 seconds. I don't know. What I'm saying is that Radahn, consort of Miquella, is a brutal wall that can feel utterly overwhelming in a way that no previous FromSoft boss has quite achieved, though Sekiro's Ishin's sword saint comes rather close. And for me personally, Malekith's second phase is torture, though that particular fight can at least be made more manageable with the Blasphemous Claw item. Although it's been the case to some extent even since Dark Souls 1, with FromSoft's later games it's become more and more the case that for some bosses you're simply expected to die a lot as part of the process. They're not all designed for you to waltz in and nail first or second or even third try. They are hard, sometimes with attacks that can be nigh on impossible to read and understand the first time you see them. And even when you are fairly familiar with the boss's moveset, sometimes shit's still just really difficult. Knowing the timings and optimal positioning to deal with attacks is only half the battle. You still have to execute it all in the heat of the moment. It's now become the norm that when a new FromSoft game comes out, there will be a certain contingent of people who say, no, enough is enough, this is too much. Hey, I've even felt it myself before. Felt it on my first playthrough of Sekiro, which was just brutal for me. I found it to be unpleasantly difficult. In fact, I still consider Sekiro to be FromSoft's hardest modern game. But I would later become progressively more in tune with its mechanics. Certainly helped by the fact that I was more acquainted with enemy behaviours and attack timings on every subsequent playthrough, not to mention the world and level design, and today I absolutely love Sekiro. I get Sekiro. I also felt this somewhat on my first playthrough of Elden Ring, where the late game grinded me down. I couldn't be bothered anymore with dying 20 plus times on every new major boss, and now on to the next one. Now, what does that say about these games? Is this a negative? I'd argue no. Some of my all-time favourite things out there are those that I either didn't like or just didn't get the first time round. One of my favourite ever albums is Obscura by the Canadian band Gorguts, but it is a noisy and complex beast which required many listens before I was able to attune my ears and mind to the incredible music within its sonic chaos. Took me 3 attempts at watching David Lynch's Blue Velvet before I managed to get through that whole thing and realise how great it was, and now I love David Lynch. I was baffled by the game Killer 7 when I first tried it 20 years ago, and I ended up selling it after playing it for just 45 minutes, but I picked it up again years later and now, you guessed it, I love that game. I even sold Dark Souls 1 the first time I played that after getting wrecked for the 15th time by the Bayle gargoyles. There have been many interesting sources of entertainment out there which have rough beginnings with me but which would eventually turn into experiences which I consider very special, with some even being formative to who I am today. Music, movies, books and games do have that power, you better believe it. However, do not misunderstand, I'm not trying to make out that all the things I like are objectively good and that if you dislike them you're just wrong and haven't tried hard enough. And I'm certainly not of the opinion that difficulty isn't a valid reason to not like something. There's always been that silly get good meme surrounding the Souls games, but you see for other games too these days. At some point over the last couple of years, the phrase skill issue started cropping up on forums and comment sections worldwide in response to any complaint pertaining to difficulty, and personally, I think skill issue is even more obnoxious than get good for 2 reasons. 1. Being good or even great at a game or games in general isn't something you should feel all that proud of, unless you're a child or teenager, or someone who actually makes a living from playing games well, in which case it's fine. Aside from those cases, games are there for entertainment. They are an indulgence, and it's rather lame for any adult to boast or denigrate others based on how skillfully they sit and indulge. However, don't get me wrong, nor do I think anyone should feel ashamed of being good at games either. It's fun being good at stuff. The second reason the skill issue response sucks is that a given game or given element of a game's difficulty level absolutely is a valid reason to not like that thing. I mean, why the hell shouldn't it be? Everything else is. And yet if you find something unpleasantly difficult, then nope, invalid criticism apparently. Now going further and saying or meaning I can't beat the game, therefore it's objectively too difficult and bad is a different sentiment, which I obviously have less sympathy for. But my greater point, I guess, if I even have a point here, is that it's okay to find something too hard. It's okay to find Radahn too hard, because he's really, really hard. But for some people, maybe that difficulty is exactly what they love about him, about Elden Ring, about all of FromSoft's games. Different strokes for different folks and all that. Me myself personally, as a Scotsman and a man and an individual, between you and me, I think I love this boss. Didn't at first mind, instead I found it rather exhausting, but at the same time I found the level of skill and optimization being demanded of me to be very compelling. I tried a bunch of different builds in Ashes of War, but like a lot of struggling folk resorted to, I ended up arming myself with a plus 25 Divine Black Steel Great Shield, which gives you 100% holy resistance, meaning all those holy attacks in Phase 2 now deal 0 damage, as long as you're guarding. In addition to this, I equipped a Blood Antspur Rapier, allowing me to poke from behind my shield and get the occasional bleed, and more importantly, Scarlet Rot. And although it still took me many desperate attempts, and although the eventual successful attempt was still intense beyond the telling of it, I did eventually beat Radahn, Consort of Miquella, and it felt pretty neat. By the way, I don't think there's anything wrong with such a build. It's a smart and effective way to handle the fight, but it is one that I felt I had to use to come out on top. And I don't think I've ever felt that way about any other FromSoft boss before, that necessity to change my character up until I found a formula that worked. On my second playthrough I brought back the shield, but this time did not rely on any Scarlet Rot, instead wielding a quality Great Katana and relying heavily on the impaling thrust Ash of War, which did fantastic damage, had great range, and was very decent at breaking posture. The third time through I endeavoured to not wield the shield, and instead learn how to properly avoid all of Miquella's holy attacks by dodging and good positioning. After beating Radahn those first 2 times, I still didn't quite know what I thought of him. It was such an intense and complex battle that I found it hard to digest, but the third encounter was the key. I spent umpteen hours one whole Sunday just hammering away at Radahn, attempt after attempt after attempt, gradually learning the dance until eventually, after one particular death in Phase 2, I thought to myself, I've got this. And just like that, 3 hours later, I had beaten Radahn without a shield, and it was one of the most rewarding victories I've had in over 25 years of gaming. It felt like my level 1 run of the game, of my prolonged struggles against the likes of the Fire Giant and Estelle and Radahn, except I wasn't level 1 here, it was level 250 something, with literally 99 points in Dex, and Morgott's Great Rune equipped. So my conclusion insofar as the final Elden Ring boss is concerned is that for as much work as it took from me to grow to love it I do, but in a way where I perfectly understand the people who hate it. Like I said, these thoughts of mine are for pre-patch Radahn, and I haven't tried the nerfed version, but even if the various nerfs to his attacks and the visuals were warranted, I'm glad as hell I got to experience him so thoroughly as he was in his prime. So what do I think of Shadow of the Erdtree? What's my conclusion? Folks, I think it's a great DLC with some incredible bosses, a few amazing levels, and a brilliant story, and that last aspect really was huge for me. Going into it and playing through the opening sections, I was feeling that buzz that I always get when playing anything new by FromSoft, some new classic to sink my teeth into, fall in love with, and then play many times over in the years to come, in the way that I've done for all their modern games. Though I still haven't played Armored Core 6, one day though. But in addition to that initial buzz, I quickly became so damn interested in the story. I was dying to know more about the realm of Shadow and the Shadow Tree, and what Miquella was doing here, and what the deal was with Messmer and Marika, and wow, we're at the shaman village where Marika originated from, and we've actually found Saint Trina, who is one of the most mysterious figures from the base game, and holy shit, the Hornsent here were into some dark stuff. Woo-wee. Look at those fingers. I loved it all, and I took great pleasure in piecing together as much as I could of the bigger picture in a way that I usually can't with FromSoft games. Usually I have little to no idea of what a FromSoft story even was after my first playthrough. I finish it and then check out a few lore videos to explain it all to me, but here I was into it. I loved this DLC's thick atmosphere of dark divinity. The process of finding more and more of Miquella's crosses and realising that he wants to become a god, and then realising that for as pure and gentle as that seems, this probably would not be a good thing for the world, not if the only way it can come about is through manipulation. I know some people were let down by the DLC's climax, of the fact that it's Radahn we fight again instead of Godwyn, of the difficulty of the Radahn fight, and especially of the final scene we get after the boss is beaten. And on that last part, yeah, I kind of agree. Was hoping for some monumental revelation when I touched that pale gold orb which appears in the middle of the arena, but instead we just get a brief restatement of what we already knew. We already knew Miquella was trying to become a god. We know he chose Radahn, we just experienced it for God's sake, we fought them. Mind you, it's not like this DLC is the first to do this. Bloodborne's The Old Hunters ends in nearly exactly the same way, where after defeating Orphan of Cause, a shadow appears and attacking it causes a very brief final cutscene to play, and then that's the end. You're just left to poke around on the beach to see if you're missing something. Regardless, I do agree that the ending could have been made a bit more rewarding and substantial, especially after beating the hardest boss FromSoft have ever made. The open world was made more layered and complex, but I did not always enjoy this, and the same applies to Shadow Keep, which exhibits much the same properties, except in a far more concentrated space. Didn't hate Shadow Keep, but I wish I liked it as much as I was clearly supposed to. I really would have loved some new mechanics, some new ways of getting round, enhanced mobility either for us or for Torrent, but instead we just got more stuff, more land and levels to explore. Yes, we did get those spirit springs which have to be activated by knocking over a pile of stones at a different location, but that's not quite what I had in mind. I want something more exotic. I did still enjoy my time travelling around this world though, and especially levels like Bayle and the stronger minor dungeons. I never want to give a falsely weighted negative impression of the aspects of the DLC that I didn't so much care for. Important to critique where appropriate, because it can lead to some interesting discussion, but at the end of the day, this DLC is essentially more Elden Ring, and I happen to love Elden Ring. Mind you, enemy variety was an issue for me. In fact, I think it was my biggest issue. Sure, a decent number of interesting and enjoyable new enemies, and a few fantastic ones, but too many old ones in too many places, and often not even very good ones. We just didn't need so many dogs and rats and more kindred of rot and undead soldiers and marionettes and a whole bunch more dragons. It's a big DLC, I get that, and I like that, but there was too much reusing of old stuff for my liking, exacerbated by how much reusing was already present in the base game. I think the major bosses are the DLC's biggest strength, to the extent that I don't dislike any of them. I don't enjoy Meta or Divine Beast Dancing Lion all that much, but I still have big appreciation for the spectacle of them. Meta is a super interesting addition to the discussion around the greater will and the cosmos, and the sonic wildness and stylistic weirdness of the Dancing Lion battle is brilliant. God damn, what a cool boss, even if I am shit at it. As for the other 9, they range from damn good to bloody fantastic. Midra and Messmer are top tier bosses, and although the brutal and merciless difficulty of promised Consort Radahn was at times overwhelming, the gradual process of learning him over my several playthroughs was some of the most fun I've had with a FromSoft game. It was such a monumental challenge, and I'm extremely glad that I got to so thoroughly experience it before the big nerf. Shadow of the Erdtree definitely wasn't perfect or ideal in every sense, or what everyone wanted, but it's still a damn good experience that impressed the shit out of me many times, and I was especially pleased with its length. Though at the same time it did take FromSoft a bloody long time to make, and it was quite pricey for a DLC. As for how it measures up against FromSoft's other DLCs, that's pretty tough to say. I don't know honestly, but what I do know is that I don't think it's the best. The Old Hunters still retains its crown in my eyes, though I sincerely hope we get something good enough to claim that crown in the future. I highly doubt there's going to be another Elden Ring DLC when you consider how bloody long it took them to make this one, and Christ knows what it'd be like if they did make another one. At this point I'm way more interested in what game they're going to come out with next, and what genre it'll be, because the whole Elden Ring project was such a game changer for them, to the extent that I don't know if FromSoft can return to the comparatively more restrictive level and world designs featured in their previous games. Whatever they come out with, be it a brand new IP, Sekiro 2, Dark Souls 4 or Bloodborne 2, I'll be here to play and eventually release a excessively long video on it about 3.5 months after everyone else has made theirs. And on that note, folks, if you made it this far, please know that I am sincerely delighted and flattered that you'd spend so much time listening to little old me prattling on for so damn long. I really hope you enjoyed my video, thank you so much for watching, and I sincerely hope you'll be here for any future videos I make. Cheers for watching, and cheerio.